discussions, but we do have intros, and so since you just joined, I'll let Destiny go if he wants to go, or if he wants to cede to you. It's up to him. But Destiny, if you're ready, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, are these like opening statements or whatever?
Yeah.
Oh, gee, how long do we have on these?
I would say 10-minute upper limit. Unless you go like way over that, that'd be the only way I'd stop you.
Guys, I'm going to bounce before you start, but best of luck. I'll be watching.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Wait, best of luck to who? Which one?
Russia. Of course.
Have a good one.
The banks.
Thank you, sir. But yeah, 10-minute upper limit. You know, I'm not going to cut anybody off unless it just goes wild with time. But yeah, go ahead, Destiny.
All right, sounds good. Well, my name is Destiny. I'm joined by my good friend, Nicholas Fuentes, here today. We are debating about the justification of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The February invasion of Ukraine cannot be justified by any means that are not overt Russian propaganda or statements that entirely dismiss the sovereignty and right to self-determination of the Ukrainian people. This invasion into Ukraine must be opposed by any means necessary, short of direct military conflict, by anyone in the West who values any of the basic tenets of liberalism or the rights of any nation to determine their own path forward in the world. Tonight, Nick might try and convince you that NATO promised it would not expand 1 inch further to the east, ignoring that these comments were originally made by Secretary of State James Baker in 1990 with regards to NATO expanding its military presence into eastern Germany, which remains demilitarized to this day. In an interview with Russia Beyond the Headlines, Gorbachev himself, the Soviet leader in 1990, during these negotiations, responded to a question asking why NATO promises hadn't been legally encoded, with Gorbachev responding, and I quote, "The topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in those years. Another issue we brought up was discussed, making sure that NATO's military structures would not advance and that additional armed forces would not be deployed on the territory of the then GDR after German reunification. Baker's statement was made in that context. Everything that could have been and needed to be done to solidify the political obligation was done and fulfilled," end quote. Nick may try to say that some verbal assurances were made between leaders, but why would anyone ever expect the geopolitical landscape of an entire continent be dictated by verbal agreements made in 1990 between only 2 nations, one that no longer even exists? This is even less reliable when you consider that the entire security situation would have radically changed with the rapid dissolution of the Soviet Union and, along with it, the Warsaw Pact. Perhaps Nick will try to tell you that NATO represents a real security threat against Russia. To that, I have to ask, a security threat preventing what exactly? Is it the invasion of Russia, which there is absolutely zero precedent for any NATO country doing? Is it the destruction of Russian forces in Russian territory, which there is also no precedent for any NATO country doing? Is it the annihilation of Russian forces in Russian allied territory by NATO countries, which has only happened when Russia has lied about its deployed paramilitary forces, as they did in 2018 in Syria during the Battle of Kasham? Perhaps, if I may suggest, instead what NATO represents is a threat to Russia's ability to undermine and interfere with the politics of its neighboring countries. Imagine a situation where Russia recognizes 2 independent self-proclaimed republics that no one else in the world recognizes. They then send in their military to secure peace, not only in the contested region, but to march far beyond that to the rest of the country, simply out of fear of the election, the democratic leader who favors dealing with the West more than Russia. I'm not even talking about the modern day conflict in Ukraine, but instead, this is the story of the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, where instead of the self-proclaimed republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, it was the self-proclaimed republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Instead of securing the important geographical funnel of Ukraine, it was establishing loyalist states in the South Caucasus region. How many of these strategically vital wars are we forced to allow Russia to engage in? I wonder if Nick will bring up broken promises and agreements of the Soviet Union and Russia that were actually put to paper. It could be the 1990 Paris Charter signed by the USSR, which, and I quote, fully recognized the freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. Will Nick mention the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, product of 4 months of intense negotiations between the Secretary General of NATO, Javier Solana, and the Russian Foreign Minister Primakov, which established the PJC, or Russian NATO Permanent Joint Council, that committed both NATO and Russia to, and I quote, build together a lasting and inclusive peace in the Euro-Atlantic area on the principles of democracy and cooperative security? I wonder if he'll mention any of the Budapest memorandums, 3 separate agreements signed in 1994 between the world's nuclear powers to eliminate the existence of nuclear weapons in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. An agreement, I should say, that required these 3 countries to give up the most reliable means they had of securing their sovereignty in exchange for promises of, and again I quote, independence and sovereignty in the existing borders, and a refrain from the threat or the use of force against Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, signed by the United States, the UK, and Russia. Maybe Nick will attack the idea of NATO being a defensive alliance and point to times where NATO has indeed acted aggressively in the past. We're supposed to ignore that none of these aggressions happened towards Russia itself, of course, but I'm curious which interventions particularly threaten Putin. Does NATO's intervention in 1995 in the Bosnian War threaten Putin's plans for neighboring countries? An intervention that ended with a precision bombing campaign that brought about an end to the indiscriminate shelling of civilian cities and towns, ethnic cleansing, and systematic mass rapes being committed during said conflict? Is Putin worried that his attacks today on Mariupol, Kharkiv, Kherson, and against countless civilians in Ukraine resemble too closely the absolute destruction he wrought in 2015 in the city of Aleppo during the Syrian civil war, or the 27,000 civilians killed when Grozny was decimated during the first Chechen war in 1994 within his own borders? Does NATO intervention in Kosovo stop the ethnic cleansing of Albanians by Yugoslavia scare Putin? Does he see himself as Milosevic, the first sitting head of state to be charged with war crimes, a man who was complacent with genocide occurring under his own military? Is he worried that he may want a repeat of what he did in Georgia, where the Russian-backed and recognized South Ossetia forces were responsible for an ethnic cleansing of Georgians, with almost 20,000 of them being displaced from their homes? Does the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya scare Putin? Does he imagine himself to be Gaddafi, a man who imprisoned, tortured, and gassed his own citizens? The man who had the incredulity to accuse Al-Qaeda of using LSD and Nest cafes to poison the minds of his political adversaries? Maybe Nick will repeat the Kremlin's talking points about the fear of Nazis in Ukraine. Where are they? Where are all these Nazis? Every time I hear someone complain about Nazis, the only two things they seem to bring up are the Azov Battalion, small force numbering less than 1,000 soldiers, and Stepan Bandera, a man who died in 1959 that remains incredibly divisive in Ukraine to this day. I'll be tickled if Nick wants to take up the position that we should be canceling people based on problematic histories and their associations with far-right movements, but I suppose we'll see what he does. Far-right Party of Svoboda today has only 15,000 members across the entirety of some 44 million people who live in Ukraine, and they only hold a single seat in that parliament. Polling data has shown that Ukrainians are some of the most welcoming people towards Jewish people in all of Eastern Europe. Between May and August of 2019, Ukraine was the only country in the world, other than Israel, Nick's favorite country, to have both a Jewish head of government, Volodymyr Groysman, and Jewish head of state, Volodymyr Zelensky. The only time in Ukraine's recent history when the Svoboda Party even had any real political influence at all was when they were being propped up by Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president. If Russia was so concerned about fascists, why would she not turn her eyes to the Russian imperial movement that operates so freely out of St. Petersburg? This is a movement that coordinates with several neo-Nazi movements all throughout Europe, even training 3 Swedish neo-Nazis before sending them back to Sweden, where they bombed a center for asylum seekers, among other attacks in Europe they've been involved in. Nothing operates within Russian borders so freely without Putin's implicit approval, so why does he not remove this organization from existence? Clearly, because Putin explicitly supports and is supported by Nazis. Dmitry Utkin is the founder of Russia's Wagner Group, and he bears Waffen-SS tattoos on his collarbone and chest. Commanding officers have been seen sporting Wehrmacht hats, giving Nazi salutes, spraying swastikas on desecrated houses and places of worship while conducting operations in Syria, the Central African Republic, and Libya on behalf of the Russian state. Lastly, maybe Nick will just appeal to the illegal coup known in Ukraine as the Revolution of Dignity, staged in 2014 by America in order to overthrow Yanukovych. There's not a shred of verifiable evidence for this. The Euromaidan protests erupted across Ukraine from late 2013 to early 2014 for a whole host of reasons. It wasn't solely due to Yanukovych, who, against the will of the parliament, exited a non-exclusive free trade agreement with the EU and entered the exclusive Eurasian Economic Union with Russia. Ukraine was widely considered in the 2010s to be one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The actual ousting of Yanukovych would only happen after he ordered his police to open fire on protesters, killing over 100 in the span of a few days, with Yanukovych ultimately fleeing the country in fear of repercussions. Who knows, maybe the shooters were secret CIA agents as well. Russia's right to security does not supersede Ukraine's right to sovereignty. If Russia has a problem with all of its neighboring members choosing to look west for their future instead of to Russia, perhaps it's an issue for Russia to sort through. Nations should be able to dictate their own security without being threatened by a neighboring power hell-bent on rebuilding a dying empire.
Mr. Fuentes, go ahead, sir.
All right. Wow. Very interesting opening statement, but I think the rebuttal, the counter argument is supposed to come after my argument. I didn't hear a whole lot of justification for the NATO position, only just sort of these preemptive counter arguments against some of the so-called Kremlin arguments, so-called pro-Russian arguments. I didn't pre-write my statement, so I'm just going off the cuff here. I'll say this. A lot of what I just heard is really wholly irrelevant to the core argument in favor of the Russian intervention, or the argument that the Russian special military operation in Ukraine is appropriate and reasonable and limited in terms of its objectives. My position has little to do with the Azov Battalion or the Galician far right. It has little to do even with the claims that the U.S. had involvement in the Maidan Revolution in 2014. It has nothing to do with the assurances made to Gorbachev that Putin claims were there and others deny. It has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do principally with the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe and specifically into Ukraine. And if you go through a timeline of events, it's really quite simple. In 1991, of course, you have the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and this is Putin famously describes this as a geopolitical catastrophe. And what he's referring to is the fact that overnight Russia loses half of its population and parts of its territory that it had controlled for hundreds of years, formerly under the Russian Empire and then under the Soviet Union. Ukraine in particular was controlled by Russia for hundreds of years. It was only an accident of how Lenin organized the Soviet Union administratively that Ukraine had any kind of autonomy or any kind of nationhood at all. But what liberals and what the NATO faction likes to do is say that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, after the former Soviet Union countries declared independence, that there's no takesies, backsies. That's just set in stone. These accidents, administrative accidents of world history, are now locked in. Ethnic Russians abroad and former Russian lands, whether they be Russian Empire or Soviet Union, are forever lost now. And the so-called sovereignty of nations that never really existed, states that never existed, must be respected ad infinitum until the end of time. And there's nothing that Russia can do about it. I find that problematic as far as the sovereignty argument goes. But let's take it a step further. NATO was formed explicitly to counter Russian power on the European continent. Of course, NATO was formed in response to Stalin's control over Eastern Europe, and it was formed to shore up Western Europe against the threat of the Soviet Union, which emerged from World War II as the second world superpower. Why then did, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the halving of Russia's population, the decimation of the Russian military, decimation of the Russian Empire, did NATO, a defensive alliance formed explicitly as a counterbalance to Russia, not only not disband with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, remain in place, but actually then expand further? And in 1997, that's exactly what they did. They announced their intention to expand. And there was, of course, the first tranche of NATO expansion in 1999 to Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. The second tranche of expansion in 2004, which included the Baltic states, as well as Slovenia and other nations. And then the third tranche in 2009 with Albania and with Croatia. What's more, in 2008, NATO declared that they would respect the aspirations of Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. It's at this point that Russia draws a firm red line. And Russia says at the outset, at the Bucharest conference in 2008, that Ukraine and Georgia would not be permitted to join NATO. They say that that's unacceptable to their security posture, that's unacceptable to their national interests. And of course, Russia then intervenes in the Georgian civil war in Abkhazia and South Ossetia to that end, destabilize Georgia, prevent them from joining Ukraine. Of course, then in 2014, you've got the Maidan Revolution. A pro-Western leader is installed. Russia intervenes in Crimea and Donbass, again, to secure their port at Sevastopol, secure their Black Sea Fleet and their power projection capability in the region, and then has fueled the civil war in Donbass ever since for the past 8 years, again, to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. It is at this point in 2014 that we saw really the fundamental root causes of the crisis. For the 22 years between the fall of the Soviet Union and the Maidan Revolution, there's no crisis in Ukraine. There is no war. There is no invasion. There are not hundreds of thousands of troops on the border. The status quo, which was to have Ukraine as a neutral buffer state, means that there is peace. It is not until the 2014 coup, when the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO becomes a real and distinct possibility, again, 6 years of NATO ignoring Russia's security concerns, that the crisis begins and Russia invades Crimea and begins fueling the separatists in Donbass. It is at this point that NATO and the West begin a full-scale demonization campaign of Russia. And they say that Russia is doing this because, and we've heard the usual line, Russia is evil. Putin is evil. He is a revanchist, meaning that his principal goal, as Destiny said, is to rebuild the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire at any cost. And it's sort of an interesting prospect that for 14 years, the most that Russia had ever done was quell separatists in Chechnya, as well as provide material support to separatists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. You know, that's some empire building project that for 14 years, there's no real expansion of the Russian state, again, outside of arguably 2 small breakaway regions in Georgia. It's in 2014, in response to a pro-Western coup in Kiev, that Russia begins its attack on Ukraine. But where was the provocation? Of course, the provocation was the continued so-called aspirations of Ukraine to join NATO, and then the ouster of democratically elected and most trusted politician in Ukraine, Yanukovych, and the installment of a rapidly anti-Russian leader. So what precipitated the crisis truly? Well, it was the Western forces. Since then, the West engages in this demonization campaign and says all along, even though they, and honestly, when Russia invaded Crimea, this caught the West off guard. The fueling of the separatists in Donbass caught the West off guard. But overnight, you know, whereas Obama said in 2012, you know, the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back, and Hillary Clinton hit the reset button with Sergei Lavrov. Overnight, we determined that Putin was always no good, evil, dictator, and so on, with these revanchist claims. After his response to the Maidan Revolution, does the United States abandon its ambitions for Ukraine to join NATO? Of course not. And these are some of the precipitating factors for the current crisis. In September of 2020, the United States flies B-52 bombers across the edge of the Crimean Peninsula and near Donbass, a very provocative action. These are nuclear-capable bombers. In June 2021, 6 months later, the United Kingdom sails a British destroyer, the HMS Defender, into disputed Black Sea waters, where it's chased out by Russia. November 10th, 2021, Ukraine and the United States sign the Charter on Strategic Partnership. And this is an updated document from 2008. Washington says it supports Ukraine's, quote, aspirations to join NATO. October 26, 2021, Ukraine begins using Turkish Bayraktar drones in Donbass, which decisively, of course, turned the tide of the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. And, of course, they purchased these Turkish drones from Turkey, a NATO country. And this is the rearmament of Ukraine. And then finally, the last straw comes in February 19, 2022, when Vladimir Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference suggests that Ukraine may rearm itself with nuclear weapons. And so you see in 2014, the installment of the pro-Western government and the prospect that Ukraine will join NATO, something that's unacceptable to Russia, which they had made clear since 2008. And then you see with the precipitating factors throughout 2020, 2021, and finally in 2022, once again, a security situation that is increasingly unacceptable for the Russian state. A nuclear Ukraine, antagonism by the British Navy in the Black Sea, by the American Air Force over Crimea and Donbass. Once again, unfazed NATO expansion into Ukraine. And I would point out, for anybody that says that Russia is some revanchist state or something like this, what does Russia have to fear from a defensive alliance? I'll reiterate. NATO was formed explicitly, this was its express purpose, to counter Russian power on the European continent. The founding purpose of NATO is to contain Russia. After the Soviet Union collapses and Russia is weak and vulnerable and amputated, NATO expands in 3 major tranches, 13 countries over the past 20 years. The combined military spending of NATO exceeds $1 trillion in just 2021 alone, compared to Russia, which has only spent $67 billion on its military. They say that Russia is revanchist because it expanded allegedly into Crimea, Donbass, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. NATO has expanded to 13 additional countries. They talk about Russian aggression when NATO has done far more military interventions in this century in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere across Africa and the Middle East, whereas Russia had a minor engagement in the Syrian civil war. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is the ignorance of the Americans and the refusal to acknowledge that America is not a benign hegemon. We are the most powerful country in the world. The purpose of the military alliance is to contain Russia, and Russia, just like Ukraine, has legitimate security interests that it is seeking to protect. And so therefore, the special operation in Ukraine is something that is reasonable and pursuant to those valid strategic goals. The United States should listen to Russia, negotiate with Russia, on some items that they can find common ground on. And if they had done that back in January, there would be no conflict. So that concludes my opening statement.
Go ahead, Destiny. We'll do some questions back and forth, and we'll maybe take questions from the audience as well. But as you guys know, the main part will be you guys questioning each other. So I'll let it begin with you, Destiny.
So before we dive in, because we agree on maybe half of this, and then some of this we have pretty big disagreements on. I'm curious if I grant almost everything you've said. Let's say that I grant that Russia has a legitimate security interest in having Ukraine be a vassal state or part of their big union. Let's say that I do grant that. Why would Russia's security interests there supersede Ukraine's sovereignty to make decisions for themselves? Why, like, under what? How would you tell an entire country, like, listen, we know you guys want to look more west. We know you want into these free trade agreements, but we can't do that because Daddy Russia's scared. So you kind of just have to cuck yourselves eternally to that country. Good luck.
Yeah, see, I've heard that argument before, and it's this question of security versus sovereignty. And, unfortunately, I think the consequence of, this NATO expansion and everything is that Zelensky was emboldened. The question is, to me, whether there's sovereignty or security, I think is sort of an abstract question. The question is, why is Russia currently in Ukraine? Well, I guess you would say that, Russia having some kind of control over Ukraine at all or influence over Ukraine at all compromises their sovereignty in favor of Russia's security. I would say this is just how great powers behave. This is unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, this is just how the world is. The question is, how do we prevent conflict in Ukraine? Why are there currently people dying? Why is there a war going on? And that is because NATO has expanded and emboldened Zelensky, and they have not negotiated with Russia. Now Russia has had to undertake something which, that they've had to demonstrate what a sphere of influence is really about, which is there's an underlying threat of the use of force. I agree with you in some sense that, Ukraine must be a vassal state for Russia to have its security, but this is how great powers operate. This is how the entire Western Hemisphere is organized. This is how Western Europe is organized.
If that's the response, then why can't I just? So I'm looking for some normativity from you, not just descriptions. Mm-hmm. But if we are just going to go on descriptions, you can't really then attack NATO for continuing to expand, because I would just utter the same back to you. Well, this is just what the United States would do. Of course, we'd want to expand our sphere of influence and include Ukraine into NATO. But at that point, you're not really left with being able to defend Russia's actions any more than I would defend NATO's actions, including Ukraine.
Well, here's what I would say the difference is that for Russia, Ukraine is a vital security interest. For NATO, Ukraine is not a vital security interest. And that really is where the difference lies, is that, once again, when you consider that, and you could say that, well, Ukraine has a right to join the NATO alliance, they may prefer, and, there's a plurality of people in Ukraine who want Ukraine to be a NATO member state. Mm-hmm. But what exactly does this do for the United Kingdom? What exactly, and really more fundamentally, what does this have anything, how does this benefit the United States of America? Because ultimately the NATO defensive alliance and security guarantee is built on the American military more than anything else, more than, the paltry contributions of Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. It's about the American defense guarantee. And so the question is, as far as Russia intervening, this is a defensive act shoring up a vital security interest. NATO expansion into Slovenia, Croatia, Ukraine. How is this? I guess I would throw it back to you. Why is this a vital security interest for the NATO countries, and more specifically the United States, which underlies the whole security guarantee?
Well, so firstly, it doesn't have to be a vital security interest. The membership into NATO is contingent upon a country wanting to join, and then contingent upon NATO membership countries wanting countries to join. It doesn't necessarily have to represent a security interest for everybody to allow countries into the fold, right? We would argue, like, did the Baltic states represent like an actual security interest for the rest of Europe? Did any of Southern, did these countries need to join NATO to shore up the security of Europe? Other people might argue that the broader peace enjoyed by Europe might be because of the expansion of NATO, that it's hard to attack a country that is under this umbrella, this guarantee of safety and peace. Other people might say, if we start seeing massive excursion or massive fleeings of refugees and everything from Ukraine, they might point to that and go, oh, well, look, there's the security interest. Similar to when we had the massive fleeing of Syrians from Syria and we had a refugee crisis across all Europe. Well, now we have refugees fleeing from Ukraine because of actions that Russia is taking into Ukraine. I noticed when you frame this conversation a lot, I'm not blaming you for this, but it's often framed as like an issue between Russia and the United States security interest. What is the Russian security interest? What is the United States security interest? What about Ukraine's security interest, right? If we talk to any of the other Eastern European NATO member states, like, oh, well, like, how are the Baltics feeling right now? How are Poland, how are Romania, how are you guys feeling right now? They're probably feeling pretty good. They're probably feeling a lot more secure. If you were to ask Ukraine, I imagine they would probably feel pretty secure as well. They probably wouldn't have to worry about their ports being taken over by Russians, breakaway states being recognized as independent. I think it's worth addressing. So to answer your question, like, in one, the security interest isn't necessarily relevant. That's not a requirement to join NATO. But two, if we are going to talk about security interests, I think we should be able to talk about the Ukrainian security interests, which is keeping their country free of Russian meddling.
Well, and I think that's actually, to ask the question is to answer it. What is Ukraine's security interest? Ukraine's not very secure right now, right? Russia is invading Ukraine. Russia is currently bombing Ukraine and involved in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And so, what was Zelensky daring Russia to intervene? When Zelensky goes to the Munich Security Conference and says, and he didn't say, because I know you're very, very technical about the details. He didn't say explicitly, we're going to get nukes, but he says, Ukraine disarmed because of the Budapest Memorandum. He said, we've asked the signatories 3 times since 2014 to shore up their promise from the Budapest Memorandum, which is to protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And we're going to ask them 1/4 and final time. But if they don't do it, then we're going to rescind all the material promises of the Budapest Memorandum, which is like an implication, which is very startling. And I think you would admit, a very provocative thing.
But it's fair.
It's almost suggesting, and you may say it's fair, but it's suggesting nuclear rearmament on Russia's border. And so, the question about security, it's like, well, this Ukrainian policy of poking the bear and saying, we're not giving up Donbass, we're not giving up Crimea, and we are considering nuclear rearmament. And then they get invaded by Russia. Obviously this is, and the point I'm trying to make is this: the expansion of NATO, it's not enhancing the security of Ukraine. It's not enhancing the security of the United States or Russia. It's a reckless action. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because the outcome has been catastrophic for the whole world. We've now got, potentially a shooting war, which could break out between Russia and the United States. This is what Zelensky is inviting. Zelensky is saying, let's have a no-fly zone over Ukraine. You understand what that entails. And the United States won't even send their fighter jets to Poland to compensate Poland, right? And so the point is this expansion, it's not good for Ukraine's security, clearly, or Russia's, or the United States. What should have been done is that Russia and the United States and Ukraine could have had a constructive dialogue about surface-to-surface missiles, about the Russian base in Crimea. And there's just, and I don't want to ramble too much. This is my last point. I'll let you respond to this. You talked about we can't enhance one country's security at the expense of another. Well, let's say, for the sake of argument, that NATO expansion enhances the security of Ukraine. Because you're right. Would this prevent Russia from intervening if it was a done deal? Probably, yes. But what does this entail? This entails that NATO now has the right to put military bases, surface-to-surface missiles, potentially ABM platforms and other things in Ukraine. It means that there's a NATO naval base in Crimea if that becomes part of Ukraine again. This is a detriment to Russian security. So by bringing NATO forces, and what is the purpose of NATO? The purpose of NATO is to contain Russia. So you've got NATO now. Again, its purpose is to contain Russia in Ukraine, right on their border. And you know how strategically important the Black Sea is. You brought those bases to Russia's doorstep. Is this a detriment to Russia's security interest? Yes. So if you talk about, enhancing one nation's security at the expense of another, that's what NATO enlargement does. The status quo ensured the security of all the countries involved. And I think the record of history is clear on this.
I don't like that it's equivalently talked about that, Ukraine's security interest is to not be fucked with, and Russia's security interest is to continue to fuck with. So I'm going to be a little bit more lenient on the side of Ukraine that doesn't want to be invaded, that doesn't want its territorial integrity constantly threatened, that doesn't want, which I am glad at least you acknowledge, that all of those Eastern separatist groups are fully funded and backed by Russian militaries, right? Lithuania doesn't have these problems. Estonia doesn't have these problems, right? You don't have these problems in countries that have joined NATO. And when you're Ukrainian and you look to the north and you look to the west and you look and you see these countries are in NATO, don't have to worry about Russia coming over to threaten your territorial integrity. I don't understand how we can say that there isn't a vital security interest there for Ukraine unless you're literally saying, well, there's not because look, Russia made it not. Right? I don't know if that's necessarily a fair thing to say, that they don't have a security interest because now Russia is afraid of them dealing with their security interests. We talk about like it's so ironic. And this is another thing that's ultra ironic too, is we talk about like, well, NATO is an organization without purpose. It was created to only contain the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And in 91, it should have been disbanded. You know, people say that. Other people say, well, maybe the expansion of NATO can ensure greater periods of peace and prosperity for Europe, which arguably it has. But now, today, now you have countries like Sweden and in Finland talking about potentially joining NATO just because of how aggressive Russia's been acting. So while you might say on one hand, like, well, look, it's not in the security interest of Ukraine because now Russia's attacking them. I could say on the other hand, well, look, this isn't in the interest of Russia because now everybody else wants to join NATO. It feels like, and even if you are pro-Russian, you have to acknowledge that today the NATO alliance is probably stronger than it ever has been. There has been like a revitalization across even NATO skeptic countries like France, even Germany that was unwilling to go as far with some of these sanctions and military equipment, even Poland that initially didn't want to contribute as much. These countries have been revitalized in purpose, united against Russia, to where if Russia doesn't succeed in Ukraine, or even if they do succeed in Ukraine, it feels like now all they've done is create a stronger NATO. I feel like something that the United States has done a decent job of, save for Iraq, at least in the past 30 years, feels like exerting soft power instead of this hard power, this idea that you need to invade and take over everything, maybe would have been a better route to go for Russia rather than I'm going to Sevastopol, I'm going to Crimea, I'm stealing your base, I'm funding these separatists, and I'm going to invade the fuck out of your country if you don't do exactly what I say. I feel like the era for that politics is past, and all Russia has done with their current actions is undermine the security of all of Europe, revitalize NATO, and threaten Ukraine's sovereignty for no real justification of its own other than they want control of that piece of land.
Well, and you even conceded, though, it's, you know, there is a vital security interest in Ukraine. It's not just because they're greedy and everything. And I would flip it on its head and say, we talk about the security of Ukraine. We're not talking about a bilateral security guarantee. We're talking about NATO, which is an empire in a sense that, you know, the NATO states are beholden to the United States. I mean, we know this, that Georgia and Ukraine, their aspirations to NATO were recognized over the objections of France and Germany in 2008. We know that the United States run NATO. We know that the United States has always run NATO. So when we talk about Ukraine, it's fine and well to say, oh, well, Ukraine might be concerned or something. But we are talking then, you know, you sort of lose your ability to talk about, oh, well, my right, my self-determination, when you're talking about inviting another empire and becoming an outpost of another empire next to Russia and putting NATO bases and listening to NATO decisions and NATO military and becoming a vassal state of NATO in a certain sense, and with the European Union too, with the currency and economic union. Are we going to pretend that there's no pressure exerted on Ukraine from Brussels and the EU? There's no pressure exerted on Ukraine in NATO from Washington, D.C. as a result of their being joined up with these supranational unions? Of course there is. And I also want to frame the conversation this way. You know, everybody talks about big bad Russia and Russia's this revanchist and Russian aggression and so on. But let's flip the script and let's put ourselves in Russia's shoes. The combined military budget of NATO, you've got more than $800 billion in military spending for the United States, $800 billion, and $350 billion for the rest of the NATO countries. So you have $1.2 trillion in military spending from NATO, which is now expanding. And again, and you can say NATO doesn't have a purpose. I think that's a little disingenuous. The purpose of NATO is to contain the Soviet Union. The purpose of NATO is to contain Russia. They're not expanding into Africa. They're not expanding into Latin America. They're expanding into Eastern Europe. They're expanding into former Warsaw Pact countries, former buffer states, former Soviet satellites. So you've got $1.2 trillion in spending on NATO. You've got 13 countries are taken over in the span of 20 years. And you're Russia, and Russia spends $67 billion, which is a less than a tenth of what NATO is spending. And the West paints Russia as the aggressor. NATO is coming to their doorstep. They've got the Baltics. They've got all these countries. Russia says a red line is Ukraine, and they say that's not good enough. We're taking Ukraine too. And of course, understand what that entails is, and you want to, I haven't heard you acknowledge this. What about Russia's legitimate security concerns about not Ukraine's safety, but NATO missiles in Ukraine? And you could say that's defensive, but everybody knows there's no such thing as a so-called defensive capability. The platforms that are used for an ABM can be used for an ICBM. The missiles, we're talking about theater support missiles, which are conventional, they could be easily equipped with nuclear warheads. They're talking about a alliance which express purpose is to contain Russia, deploying ABM, surface-to-surface missiles, to forward deploying a base in Ukraine, in the Black Sea, in order to project power explicitly against Moscow and against the Caucasus region and through the Black Sea. And NATO is vastly more powerful than Russia. So the idea, and then this undermines the whole idea, if Russia is this revanchist state, nobody in their right mind on the West or the East thinks that Russia is even going to be able to occupy Ukraine, let alone rebuild their empire. You talk about all of Central Asia, the Baltic states, the Warsaw Pact countries, forget about it. They won't even be able to occupy all of Ukraine in the foreseeable future. They're having difficulty even winning Ukraine in a short amount of time. So the idea that Russia poses this threat, they're going to roll into Poland or something, that the aggression must be contained, it's laughable. 67 billion against 1.2 trillion, and everybody's pointing the finger and saying, Russia must be contained at any cost. I think it says that America's rule is innocuous and benign, and that's not the case. It says that NATO's expansion is innocuous and not threatening. That's clearly not the case, and the numbers itself speak to this.
We can talk about the numbers, but you can keep saying 1 trillion to 60 billion all you want. How many times has NATO invaded Russia? How many times has NATO threatened aggression towards Russia? It hasn't happened. And, we can talk about security interests. It's funny you mentioned the ABM missile platforms and everything. An ABM missile platform cannot fire an ICBM. The anti-ballistic missile platforms that we installed in Poland, you can look at me all you want, but Biden himself literally invited Russian inspectors to come in and inspect these things. Just because it's a tube in the ground doesn't mean that you can just as easily throw a different type of missile, an ICBM, in there. There's a whole different apparatus. There's a whole different hardware requirement for firing these missiles. There's a whole different software requirement for firing these missiles. Tubes in the ground are not just things you can stick whatever missile you want in and happen to fire nuclear warheads out of. It just doesn't work that way. And again, Biden's invitation of Russia to inspect these platforms, I think, proves just as much as that. When we talk about how there's pressure from Washington or pressure from the West on what could be Ukraine's economy, we talk about threatening their sovereignty. Just the comparison is just totally unfair. If Ukraine chooses to be pressured by joining those types of free trade agreements, by joining those types of NATO alliances, I feel like that mounts the pressure onto you then to answer. If there is so much pressure from Washington militarily, if there's so much pressure from Brussels economically, if there's so much pressure from all these Western institutions, why is Ukraine so eager to join them? Clearly, there must be mounting pressure in the opposite direction as well, right? And we're comparing on the Western hand, the ability to join these free trade agreements, and then on the Eastern hand, the forcible entry into customs unions that would heavily restrict your trade, because now you've got shared external tariffs and everything. The idea that there is some massive pressure from the West that threatens your sovereignty in a way that there isn't from the East, when Ukraine seems to be eagerly trying to join the West, just doesn't make sense. Why? Their actions and the desire of their population just doesn't seem to speak to that idea that there's so much horrible pressure from the West. Something else that I also disagree with, and then you can answer this, because all of this keeps getting framed. Now, I said initially, I'll agree with all of that, and then I'll ask you a question about Ukraine. But now I want to challenge the framing of one of these things. We talk about vital security interests. I don't buy it. I don't agree with it. I've seen you talk about the funnel. I've seen other people talk about geography. Historically, Russia's been invaded a number of times through Ukraine. But I have to ask you honestly, if Ukraine was to join NATO, do we really think that there are going to be troops invading Russia? Does Putin really think that Ukraine's ascension into NATO means there's going to be some sort of ground invasion or some sort of threat of force from NATO into Russia? If so, it hasn't happened in the Baltics yet. We haven't seen it anywhere else. What is there? I disagree that there is an actual security interest in Ukraine. I think that the interest lies more in the rebuilding of the empire and more of Putin establishing his order farther out from Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that this is just it's sort of almost a willfully ignorant position. And I understand if you like guzzle State Department propaganda, I understand why you might say like, well, how could NATO possibly pose a threat to Russia? It says it right here. It's a defensive alliance. Once again, the purpose of NATO, and I don't understand why you refuse to acknowledge this. The purpose of NATO is to contain Russia, and contain means we want to stop Russia. We want to prevent the influence of Russia. That's a hostile action. Okay. And we're aimed at creating a sort of circle around Russia. We want to contain, that's what NATO is for. And NATO is more than 10-1 more powerful than Russia. And so NATO then moving into the Black Sea, moving into Crimea, moving into Ukraine, 100 kilometers from Moscow, just by its very existence, this presents a security threat to Russia. You could say all you want, well, I can't imagine a scenario. Well, American leaders talk about this stuff all the time. I mean, ever since the Russian incursion into Crimea and their support for the Donbass, we hear from American leaders, they say Putin's a killer, Putin's a thug, Putin's a dictator. We know that it is the wet dream of the neocons and of the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department to depose Putin. This is why Western agencies back Putin's opponents like Navalny and some of the opposition parties. We know that this is what America does. They spy on Russia. We know that we back the anti-Putin resistance. It's the wet dream of the United States to have a color revolution in Russia, just like they had in Ukraine, just like that in Georgia, just like that in Kazakhstan. And so the idea that we can't possibly fathom a scenario where Russia would be threatened again, more than 10-1. That'd be like if I went outside your house with a tank and a nuclear bomb and a light machine gun, and I came there and said, I fucking hate Destiny. I was like, but don't worry, I'm just here to protect like your neighbors or something. And you're like, oh, well, he said it's defensive. That's okay. Again, you have to look at the history here of the Cold War. The antagonism between the West and the East doesn't evaporate overnight. And certainly, once again, NATO's founding purpose contained Russia, and then it expands to Russia's borders, and to say like, oh, Russia has nothing to worry about here. It's just a refusal to acknowledge the Russian perspective. And this is where America's got its blinders on. It cannot see its own culpability. It has no ability for introspection and to say, what is our role in the crisis? Are we enhancing again, the question, are we enhancing Ukraine's security at the expense of Russia? I mean, the answer is undoubtedly yes. And again, the thing about the ABMs is just not true. The ABM platforms can be converted into platforms that can launch offensive missiles in a matter of weeks. I mean, this is just, and you can look into this. I'm not a military expert, but this is what the experts say. The ABM shield, we all know defensive capabilities can become offensive capabilities in a matter of weeks. They do have to be converted, but the hardware is there. And I would even get to some of the treaties. And this is something I didn't get into in my opening statement. And I really want to talk about the missiles. I want to hear your take on this. In 2001, the United States pulls out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was signed under Nixon. And for people that don't know, the United States and the Soviet Union agree we're not going to build anti-ballistic missile systems because it undermines mutually assured destruction. If a country is creating a shield where ICBMs may not be effective, this is going to only cause an arms race where countries will want to stockpile massive amounts of missiles and nuclear warheads, because if they got to go through a shield, then they're going to need twice as many missiles. So the Soviet Union and the United States agree, okay, no ballistic missile shield, shooting down missiles is not part of our doctrine because this would incentivize an arms race. Well, in 2001, the United States pulls out of the treaty and says, you know what, we're going to build an anti-ballistic missile shield. And they say, well, don't worry, Russia, that's because of Iran. And so they start implementing this ABM shield, again, which undermines mutually assured destruction. Russia can't invest in this. ABM is very expensive and very complex. Russia does not have the capability. So what we're talking about here is the United States pursuing technology that would, and it's very difficult, and they're nowhere close to this, but it's the threat of it, create a system where they could potentially do a first strike against Russia and Russia could not retaliate, undermines mutually assured destruction. Again, in 2019, under Trump, the U.S. suspends its treaty obligations to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They change American military doctrine and say that now surface-to-surface short and medium-range ballistic missiles are part of their military doctrine in Eastern Europe. So we're talking about potentially theoretically in a military engagement with Russia, launching surface-to-surface missiles from Eastern Europe into Russia. And Russia says, hey, what's going on? You're suspending the ABM shield. Now we need to invest in hypersonic gliders and hypersonic missiles. You're undermining mutually assured destruction. In 2019, Russia says hang on, this last point, and then because I'm going a little long, then I'll let you respond. Mm-hmm. Russia says, hey, you're redeploying missiles to Europe. He says, why don't we just ban? He says, let's put a moratorium on all the missiles, because what's going to happen is if you shoot a missile against us, we don't know if it's nuclear or conventional and until it lands. So, that's something called warhead ambiguity. We would have to respond with a nuclear strike if we see a missile coming our way. The United States refuses to negotiate, and the United States pulled out of the treaty first. So, you say, how could they possibly be threatened? It's like, okay, well, NATO's expanding. Its purpose is to contain. The missiles are coming with it. The bases are coming with it. They're pulling out of the EBM treaty. They're pulling out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. It's like, again, does the United States have no ability to look and see, gee, am I the problem here? But I'll let you respond.
Yeah, the ABM treaty is garbage. Why would you want to be part of a treaty where only Russia and the United States are signed onto it? What about China? What about the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea? What about Iran? What about any other rogue state in the world that might obtain nuclear weapons? So this might come down to a disagreement on the matter of facts, and I maybe we just disagree on this, but my understanding is that nuclear weapons, ICBMs, are relatively sophisticated in terms of how they launch and the deployment systems for the nuclear warheads. You can put MIRVs on these things. A single missile can fire off like 100 different warheads, some which might be nuclear, some which might be dummy, that there are thousands of these things on both sides. I don't believe that anybody believes that anybody on the Russian or US side has anywhere near the capability right now to stop a legitimate second strike threat from any country. That if either side launches a nuke, everything's going into the air, and there is no shot that across the entire geography of the United States, we have the capability to stop not only whatever weapons are shot from Russia, but whatever pops out of the ocean, whatever pops out of the Pacific and Atlantic, whatever comes by plane. There's no reliable way right now to stop. Like, Russia's second strike capabilities have not been threatened. And my understanding is that the ABM treaty is seen as kind of bullshit for the same reasons why some of the climate accords are seen as kind of bullshit. The United States doesn't want to necessarily play climate games when people like India or China have so many exemptions from these same things. Same thing with the ABM treaties. Like, that's great that the United States and Russia might come to some agreement, but I don't know what North Korea is doing. I don't know what Iran is doing. I don't know if I want to hamper my own abilities to deter a nuclear threat from one of these smaller states. I don't believe that Russia's nuclear capabilities have been compromised. And I'm pretty confident in saying that, because if they were, I feel like Putin would be screaming that from the rooftops every single day. I think that would be the first thing out of his mouth every time he talks. Because for however much I might hate Russia and however much I might hate nuclear weapons, some level of mutually assured destruction is probably good in maintaining some level of peace between countries. You nod your head, but I mean, Ukraine probably felt that way too before they deposed of their nuclear arms, and then Russia invaded them when they no longer had the ability to defend themselves from another nuclear power from invasion. In terms of like being afraid of a color revolution, I mean, now we've gone from, we're worried that the United States might lead a NATO invasion from Ukraine into Russia, into what are usually the liberal arguments of, well, if Russia sees a thriving, happy democracy on its border that's more west facing, maybe the people in Russia are going to be really upset and they're going to revolt and there's going to be issues there. That doesn't seem to be a good argument for Russia invading Ukraine, because they're so scared that some successful country on their border might, instigate some revolution in their own borders, unless I guess we want to take this step further and say it's all like CIA coup, CIA operatives on the ground, fomenting distrust in the government. I don't think that's a good argument for them being able to invade Ukraine. Backing up, I have to ask, because you keep mentioning and you keep repeating these points about NATO is an aggressive alliance, NATO is encircling Russia. When has NATO taken aggressive action against Russia? And if these ABM platforms are so threatening, why is it that I think just less in February, Biden is literally he's welcoming Putin to come and inspect these platforms. Of course, he wants to be able to inspect platforms in Russia as well. Why would we allow them to do that if the tech is so easy to swap out? You say that it can happen in a matter of weeks. I mean, Russia surveillance will catch that. It's not like you're going to be moving this stuff around and changing up these platforms entirely without anybody seeing that happening. Surveillance is where it is right now in 2022. What is the threat that NATO represents to Russia? What is the threat? What is the perceived security risk aside from Russia not being able to invade partnering countries?
Yeah, so I've never said that NATO, it's a NATO invasion in Russia that's going to happen, or NATO. I didn't say it's an aggressive alliance. I said that the founding purpose of NATO is to contain Russia. So it's not like this is just an alliance like la-di-da, we all want to have safety and security. It's like, no, we are shoring up these countries against Russia. Russia cannot join NATO. NATO would not permit Russia to join. Wouldn't that be great for world security if the United States and Russia were in an alliance? That would probably be the best thing for world peace. But Russia is precluded from joining because NATO is an anti-Russian alliance. And you could just as easily say Russia's never invaded a NATO country. Russia's never invaded a NATO country. Russia's never invaded a Western country, never invaded the United States or anything like that. And yet there's this fear that they're going to invade. And the point is, Russia's borders are not on the border of Germany, but NATO's borders are now on the border of Russia. And I've said this before, the mere numbers itself speak to the threat. This is a counter-Russian alliance, which outspends Russia 10-1, which is now on their border in the Black Sea, in Crimea. And what's the security threat posed? How about an ABM shield? How about surface-to-surface ballistic missiles stationed all over Ukraine? Surface-to-surface missiles which can reach Russia in 5 minutes and are unstoppable and indistinguishable from a nuclear warhead. What's the potential risk? And, again, a lot of this has to do with something called the security dilemma. It's not to say that, because I'll grant you, it may seem outlandish. Oh, is NATO going to invade Russia? Probably not anytime soon. But it's like the job of Moscow and the job of the Russian government is to secure Russia against all threats. If there is this capability that NATO, with this, again, 10-1, massive military, far more sophisticated, and more stuff and far outspends and bigger population, if it's on their border, that in itself is a threat. That existence of all that concentrated power and that tripwire right on the border, it's a huge threat. And even, going back to the ABM shield, I'll grant you, is there a legitimate reason for the United States to pull out of the ABM shield? Yeah, absolutely. You're right. China's not a part of it, and there are rogue states that are nuclearizing. So I understand what you're saying. But this does nothing for Russia because now, and you're right, the ABM shield is far from working, right? We don't know how to shoot down ICBMs reliably yet. But the United States pulls out of the ABM treaty with no regard for how this affects Russian doctrine. Russia cannot spend on ABM. ABM is very expensive. It's very complex. They just don't have the means for that. And so when the United States says, we're going to create an ABM shield, but don't worry, we're going to put it throughout Europe, we're going to put it in Poland, and we're going to put it over here, which could theoretically, in a theoretical context, prevent Russia from doing a retaliatory strike. This is a very provocative thing towards Russia. You may say, oh, Russia's got nothing to worry about, but that's the American perspective. What about the Russian perspective, where it's like, gee, are they going to build an ABM shield and they will have the ability? Even if the United States just had the perceived ability to strike Russia with impunity, that would be enough to present a security threat to Russia, which is the point. And so there's almost no consideration. It's like, oh, well, come on, they're not going to invade. Oh, come on, that's not a big deal. What about the Russian perspective? What about if you're Russia and you see missiles coming to Ukraine and you see the ABM shield pull up and they're pulling out of the treaties and theater support missiles are now back on the table in Europe? And you say, well, why wouldn't Putin talk about this? He did in 2021 in November. Putin in 2020, when the United States formally pulled out of the intermediate range nuclear treaty, Russia said, listen, I've got a proposal. Let's put a moratorium on all the missiles in Europe. The United States didn't respond. In November 2020, Putin reiterates, he said, I've even got a more detailed proposal and we're going to inspect the sites and you can inspect our sites and it's a robust mechanism. No response. In December 2021, in a press conference, Putin comes and says, I don't know why the West isn't talking about my missile proposal. In January 11th, 12th, and 13th, the Geneva talks, they say, agree with us on missiles. Even the American security experts say that there's room for common ground, but they don't accede to the demands because, we don't negotiate with dictators. We will not be, held hostage by dictators. So it's like, what more can you do when they're deploying missiles that can strike Russia in 5 minutes on their border? And the purpose of the alliance is to contain Russia. Yeah, NATO never invaded Russia. Russia also never invaded NATO. But who's expanding on whose border with their missiles and military base? Who's got the defensive alliance, which is designed to fight Russia? It's not Russia.
Yeah,
so
I keep hearing this over and over again, and maybe what this is, we've hit rock bottom. We keep saying the purpose of the alliance is to contain Russia. Contain Russia from doing what? invading their neighboring countries. Like if Russia didn't engage in these actions, it shouldn't really matter. It's not like this is containing or trying to contain Russia in an economic sense, like we're cutting them off from trade deals, or like we're trying to blockade their cruisers, or we're trying to compromise their ability to move anything throughout the world. Like this isn't the case. We talk about like containing Russia, and it sounds like we're saying we don't want to contain Russia from invading countries on their border. That's just that explanation just defies logic to me. You know, we talk about this idea that, again, and we're always framing this in the case of U.S. security interests versus Russian security interests. Is Ukrainian security interest just not at play here? Do we just not care about this? And Ukraine has a genuine security interest, and that they want themselves to be a sovereign country with the right to decide which alliances they will or will not join. And the idea that there might be NATO bases here in the future, that Biden is open to inspection, the idea that down the road, maybe second strike capabilities are lost in Russia and now they just get nuked by the US because we can do so with impunity. Maybe that'll happen 30 years from now. So now today we need to take over Ukraine. I don't know. I totally don't buy that as a reason. I feel like you could use that same justification then for Russia to essentially invade anybody they want that's near their borders and isn't claimed up by NATO yet, which if is the case, then that's an even stronger argument for NATO expansion. Every NATO country feels like, well, holy shit, literally these 4 letters are the only thing that keep my country from being invaded by Putin. Damn, NATO membership sounds like a pretty good thing right now. I don't feel like you've established a credible threat to Russia. You keep mentioning like the surface to surface missiles that can reach Moscow in 5 minutes. I mean, like if we were in like the 50s, maybe this would matter that we've lost second strike capability because, oh no, the whole government is wiped out. Nobody even saw the missiles coming. But this isn't the case anymore. There continuity of government exists. There are submarines all over the world from every nuclear power that's capable of emerging in the Pacific or in the Atlantic and nuking, shooting God knows how many nuclear missiles at God knows how many targets if second strike is something that needs to happen. You're not losing second strike unless you have from Metal Gear Solid some crazy anti-ballistic shield where you yourself say the technology doesn't exist yet. We're nowhere near that yet. And yeah, the idea that surface-to-surface missiles might exist in some part of these NATO countries that are, again, open to inspection from Russian leaders, that this somehow justifies Russia invading these countries for hypothetical security interests in the future. I just don't think that argument is strong enough.
Well, and here's the thing. Even if you think all my arguments are Russian propaganda, like the reason why, because I know the NATO side says, oh, the security thing is just a pretext for Russian revanchism. That's all propaganda. What would even give Russian propaganda credibility, if that's what this was, is the fact that nobody on the NATO side they won't even begin to acknowledge how Russia might have a legitimate security concern. Like, again, you just sort of hand wave away. Oh, so what? Maybe in 30 years, Russia can't retaliate. So what? Maybe they develop an ABM shield. So what? You have surface-to-surface missiles forward deployed in Ukraine. Like, big deal. That is a really big deal. That is a really big threat to Russia. And that NATO was formed to contain Russia. When we say contain, we mean we want to suffocate Russia. That's the goal of the NATO alliance. That's a goal now of NATO expansion, is to prevent Russia from influencing its neighbors, and by the way, that's just what great power politics is, as countries seek to influence their neighbors. It just so happens that the entire Western Hemisphere and Western Europe is the sphere of influence of the United States of America. And everybody knows full well that if Russia deployed the same capabilities to Cuba, if Cuba was in a defensive alliance, if Cuba joined the Warsaw Pact, if Russia deployed surface-to-surface missiles in Cuba, if they had a base in Cuba, everybody knows the United States would not tolerate it. Everybody knows the United States. And you could say, oh, well, Cuba's right and so on. But the foreign policy establishment in the United States would not tolerate it. Nobody would even dream of tolerating that anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Not in Cuba, not in Venezuela, not in Bolivia, not in Nicaragua, nowhere. But we're able to shore up in Crimea. Crimea is historically Russian clay. Okay, I mean, this is a 70-year fluke that Crimea belongs to the autonomous part of Ukraine. It's just nonsense. The idea that we'd have a NATO base in Crimea, it's just like unfathomable. This Russian security apparatus cannot allow that. I mean, they just can't in good conscience allow that kind of a security threat. And I mean, you won't even interact with that argument. It's like, well, I mean, it probably won't happen. Well, it's probably like not a big deal. Well, for the Russians, it clearly is. And the point is to say this. in this stuff about like, thriving democracy and Ukraine shows, this stuff is really semantics. What we're talking about here is two great powers, two empires, and they're duking it out over formerly neutral ground. That's what it is. Ukraine is, neutral, ostensibly somewhat under Russian influence. And I would say it truly is neutral because in 2004, right, you get Yushchenko. And Yanukovych wasn't this pro-Russian stooge that people make him out to be. He tried to balance the West against Russia. He definitely leaned closer to Russia. Ukraine was truly a buffer neutral state, if not leaning slightly towards Russia, right? And the point is, and maybe to get more fundamentally to the heart of the issue, why is there a conflict here in Ukraine? What caused this? We cannot acknowledge the fact that we have catalyzed this by trying to wrest control of Ukraine from Moscow. It's about two empires competing over a neutral state. And, to say, it's about democracy or this one or that one chose. It's got to do with missile placement. It's got to do with mutually assured destruction. It's got to do with all these things. And people will, again, acknowledge the Ukrainian security interest, the American security interest, but not the Russian. And, I just don't. I'm not getting from you that you really understand what that means for the Russians. Like, I'm fully willing to concede, I get why Ukraine wants to be part of NATO. I get why NATO wants Ukraine to be part of NATO. It's part of their policy of containment. But there's no willingness on the other side to say, let's give Russia the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it is legitimate security concern to erode mutually assured destruction, which has been in place for 40 years. Maybe this is antagonistic towards Russia to put surface-to-surface missiles, reintroduce where they were not in 19, reintroduce theater support missiles as the backbone of American military doctrine. Like, there's no willingness to say, Russia maybe has legitimate opposition to that. It's like, oh, no. That's just all an excuse because Russia's evil and Russia wants to invade everybody. And it's like, that's belied by the fact that Russia is outspent more than 10-1 by the anti-Russian alliance. So.
We can keep bringing up the 10-1 spending. I don't think it's doing anything to building your argument. I can acknowledge that Putin might perceive there to be a security interest. I can acknowledge that. Yeah, I can acknowledge that perception exists. And I say might because we both agree here that NATO has never made an aggressive move towards Russia.
And Russia's never made an aggressive move towards NATO.
Which is a good reason for Ukraine to join NATO so that they stop being fucked with by Russia. That's an argument for Ukraine joining NATO. But the fact that NATO can expand to include Ukraine, when we both agree that NATO doesn't attack Russia, we have special phone lines installed. So when there's conflict in the Middle East, the US will literally call Russia and say, hey, you have any guys there? We don't want to blow your own people up accidentally. We go out of our way right now to ensure that there isn't conflict between NATO and Russia. And even if I can acknowledge that there might be a perception on the Russian side that there might be a security interest here, that perception doesn't supersede Ukraine's right to self-determination. And if you want to take the boring realist analysis of this, that's fine, but you're not getting any normativity from that. You're not telling me whether Russia's decision is right or wrong or whether it's morally or whatever justified. You're just telling me that Russia will seek to basically annex whatever neighbor it can if it perceives there to be a security threat, which again is just a stronger argument for a more aggressive expansion of NATO. When you use a realist perspective on Russia's dealings with its neighbor, all you're doing is revitalizing the arguments for a NATO alliance. And that's really all that's happened. Returning to the beginning of my argument, you've got countries like Sweden and Finland that are looking to join NATO. Since 2014 and Russia's invasions of Crimea, you started to see active NATO military forces being deployed to places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I feel like all the realist perspective does here is give us an even stronger argument for why NATO needs to expand to include these Central Asian and Eastern European countries, because if they don't, then Russia's just going to seek to invade them.
Okay, but this belies the fact that NATO expanded first. So NATO expands to 13 countries over 20 years, to former Warsaw Pact countries, to former Russian states, to former Russian sphere of influence. Russia draws a red line and says you can't take Ukraine. Ukraine is so vitally strategically important, you can't take it. NATO says, well, yeah, we're expanding there anyway. Boo-hoo, that's too bad. And then Russia responds, and then he goes, see, that justifies why we've been expanding for 20 years. You see, that just proves. Hang on, I'll let you finish. Go ahead. That just proves. It's like. But NATO expanded first. The United States pulled out of the ABM Treaty in 2001. They pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 19. They expanded to 13 countries before 2009. And then when Russia finally responds in 2014, a red line was crossed. And then NATO goes, see, that's why we were expanding. See, that just goes to show why you need NATO. It's like, and the point is, on the realist perspective, what is our foreign policy? What are we trying to do? Because I mean, and to the point, getting back to the conflict which is ongoing in Ukraine. I don't like conflict. I don't like when people die in Ukraine. I don't like when Ukraine's destroyed. This is not in anybody's interest. This is not good for Ukraine, obviously. This is not good for America. This is not good for Russia. But what led us to this point? You know, I fail to see why, because there was no imminent threat of a Russian invasion in Ukraine. The problem was that Zelensky was unwilling, or Poroshenko too, unwilling to give up Donbass, unwilling to give up Crimea, unwilling to give up their aspirations to NATO. And the reason that Ukraine was so emboldened is because NATO said, we got your back. Ukraine would never dare to stand up to Russia and poke them like they do, but they think that they've got NATO. They get to go to Congress and demand a no-fly zone. And it's like, so what is in realist terms, in terms of how states actually behave, not normatively, not how they ought to behave, but in terms of how we know states act and in terms of how we can expect states to act, expanding NATO to Ukraine or even talking about that is a provocative action. But we have done that ever since 2008. And that is what has led to the current crisis. And you could argue in a hypothetical timeline, does Russia invade Ukraine without the NATO aspirations? We can't know that. But we also can't, arrive at the situation without analyzing our own behavior and saying, how have our actions provoked Russia? Because, at the end of the day, we have to talk in terms of the tangible and the real. This is the real outcome, and it's really bad. And this is a failure, ultimately, of American policy. And you could point the blame at Russia and, fold your arms and say, well, Russia's just evil, and, they're just doing evil things, and you have to blame Russia because they're evil, and so on. And, we have no culpability. But of course, in great power politics, yes, we have culpability. We're a global and a regional hegemon. So we do have to have some introspection and analyze how did our collective policy, how did our policy of collective security, Russian containment, did that play a role in provoking Russia to engage in a conflict where nobody wins? We have to look at it like that. And I think you'll find that these policies we're undertaking, it's naive to say that they're just so goody two shoes in nature. Oh, Ukraine joining NATO, it's totally innocuous. It's totally above board. Don't criticize it like, oh, a country wants sovereignty and security. Who can blame them for that? It's like, well, look at the other side. It's a negotiation. Everybody's security interest is being paid attention to except for Russia. But Russia has guns too. And in a realist world order, you have to pay attention to these things. Otherwise, you get a crisis. And then I want to say one thing. And then here's the other thing. Let's entertain a scenario where Ukraine joins NATO, because they're still pushing for it, even after the crisis in 2014. Let's say today, what's that?
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's say Ukraine becomes a NATO member state. Okay, what do you do? Well, guess what? Crimea is still formally occupied by Russia. Donbass and the civil war between Kiev and Donbass is still ongoing. So what happens then when the government in Kiev is at war with Russian-backed proxies in Donbass? As a consequence of Ukraine joining NATO, you now have a proxy war in Ukraine, a proxy civil war between Russian-backed separatists and a NATO member state. What's more, Kiev does not acknowledge the Russian annexation of Crimea. I mean, they do not accept this fact. So, now we're in a really bad security spot where, and you could say, oh, well, this would never happen because people would never do this. But I mean, of course, these things can happen. What happens if there's a war between Russia and Ukraine over Crimea? What happens when there's there's this ongoing proxy war between Russian-backed separatists in Donbass and Ukraine? And I've heard the argument, people say, Zelensky says, well, NATO's defensive, so Article 5 obligations aren't invoked if we attack Russia or something. But as we know, the fog of war is thick. And as to who started which conflict, of course, it would benefit the Ukrainians to say, oh, well, Russia attacked us. Now we need to fold NATO response in Crimea. The point is, you don't need to be pro-Russian or pro-American. You don't need to be an expert to say that's a really fucked up situation. It is a bad situation to have a NATO member state with disputed territory in Crimea and a proxy civil war in Donbass. Like that is probably the biggest threat to World War III in the entire world. That's probably so that American policymakers would seriously consider this in spite of what's going on. The moment that Russia invaded Crimea, the United States should have said, you know what, it's too complicated. We can't get involved. But even in 2021, they're saying we're going to enhance our strategic partnership. Ukraine will become a part of NATO. It's like, we know that Russia's not giving up Crimea. We know that the thing in Donbass isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. So even if we achieved our aspirations, all this would do is create a situation, a powder keg, that could absolutely lead to World War III, maybe the #1 cause of World War III if that were to happen.
Sure. So just to shoot down the last point very quickly, nations with contested territory can't join NATO. It would never be the case that we would admit Ukraine to join while there is contested territory, unless Ukraine was willing to cede that immediately to Russia. So that's completely off the table right there. In terms of Ukraine, oh man, there's so many arguments to go through. One of the very first thing you talk about how like NATO expanded first. NATO was the aggressor first. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. When I was searching through, in post-Cold War era conflict, right? What's happening in Europe? One of the first conflicts that happened was Russia supporting the breakaway state in Moldova during the Transnistria War. So Russia had already established a pattern of you find separatists, you fund them, you export a fuck ton of Russian passports, you get these people set up and established, and they're on breakaway state. You send Russian peacekeeper troops there, and that's literally right on the Ukrainian border. So we've already got a map for what would happen in the future in South Ossetia, in Georgia, and then in what's happening now in Donbass and Ukraine. The idea that NATO is forcing Russia's hands here, when I think Russia has already had the blueprint for this exact type of action, I don't agree with that. I think that Russia has already established that pattern of behavior. In terms of, I feel like everything else is repeating over and over again. I don't even like using the realist analysis. I think it's garbage. I don't think anybody even agrees with using realism to analyze foreign policies anymore. I know that you like to talk about, I think I called him Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer's analysis of like the state of security in 1990 and onwards from Europe. He's written a lot of essays about it. He wrote a huge one, like a 50-page paper in 1990 predicting the future state of security in Europe. It was garbage. It was horrible. His prediction that Europe would descend into constant anarchy, that countries like Japan and the United States would be looking to vie for interest here, that every country would be rearming because that's what realist countries do. It just totally and completely missed the mark. I don't think anybody takes those predictions seriously in terms of this is how countries will act. So I don't know if it's appropriate to go forward into the future when he's already failed to make successful predictions of what has really been a relatively peaceful period for 30 years in Europe, and then try to say that this frame of analysis is what we're going to use going forward when it comes to dealing with Ukraine and Russia. And then again, what's more to reiterate for the 50 millionth time, all of these realist arguments, if we are to accept them, justifies NATO including Ukraine and being aggressive towards Russia just as much as it does Russia taking over Ukraine and I guess establishing security around its own borders. But again, I mean, I can ask you again, and I know that we'll kind of dance around again, like NATO has not shown itself to be aggressive towards Russia. The most and best you can possibly say is that there are surface-to-surface missile bases in some of these NATO countries, but I mean, what? Like honestly, do you really believe that NATO countries are going to start launching missiles into Moscow? Like, do you really believe that, or is this something you're worried 20 or 30 years from now? Or do you think that the investment into ABM technology is going to become so good that, at some point we did it, guys, we beat second strike capability, time to just nuke the hell out of Russia? That sounds fantastical to me. Now, maybe we can imagine a world where that happens, but I can't use that imaginary world to justify the invasion, destruction of civilian cities, and the takeover of a sovereign nation that exists today in the real world. That would be insane to me. That sort of justification can be used for Russia to invade literally any neighbor that they could perceive in 30 years to be a threat because of technology that doesn't exist yet. I just think that's absolutely insane.
Yeah, so to address the first part, I mean, to say that backing the Moldovan separatists is a precursor to NATO expanding to 13 countries is just ridiculous. And as far as realism goes, what realism does is it's a frame for how we explain how states behave. That's what international relations theory seeks to do, is let's analyze and explain how states behave. Why do they do the things that they do? And what realism says is that the decisions of states and the way that states behave is based on something called the security dilemma. That fundamentally states seek security. They want to secure their border. They want to secure, they want to create offensive and defensive capabilities that protect them from their adversaries. Certainly, this explains the Russian policy. This realist framework of security and explaining Moscow's behavior in Ukraine absolutely explains it. It has nothing to do with ideology, nothing to do with ideas, nothing to do with interconnected institutions. It's about the raw military capabilities of the NATO defensive alliance. And you say, oh, well, Mearsheimer's predictive analysis didn't work in the 90s. Well, it absolutely worked in 2014. In 2014, he'd had it down to a T. He predicted the next 8 years of conflict based on the realist interpretation of how states behave. He said, and he said this in 14. He said, Moscow will never accept Ukraine joining NATO. He said Moscow would sooner destroy Ukraine than have Ukraine join NATO. He said it's unacceptable. And this is true. This has been reiterated by Russia, by Putin, and this has been their policy for the past 8 years. As far as, Ukraine becoming a NATO member state, well, that's just off the table because of disputed territory. It's like, yeah, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? That's kind of the problem, that Russia came in there and said, look, I'm taking this off the table. I'm going to create disputed territory to take NATO membership off the table. And NATO persists. And NATO says, no, we don't even care. It's like, okay, so what's the end game then? If there's disputed territory, that's not being resolved anytime soon. Russia's not going to be dislodged from Crimea, and the war in Donbass goes on. So why is NATO membership being discussed? Why is the United States strengthening its security guarantee to Ukraine in November 2021, if that's the case? I agree with you. Yes, exactly. NATO membership cannot be expanded to countries with disputed territory. And yet the conversation goes on 8 years into the civil war in Donbass, 8 years after the annexation of Crimea. So exactly, why is that conversation going on? It's a horrible nightmare scenario to imagine that Ukraine would become a NATO member state with these ongoing crises that have no sign of abating, yet it does. This is a horrifying thing. And then to the point of, well, oh, come on, NATO's never going to invade Russia. And this is the problem, I think, this is where your analysis fails. It's this naive worldview where it says like, oh, well, that'll never happen. Russia has nothing to worry about. It's like, okay. Yeah, Russia would never nuke the United States, right? Russia would never nuke the United States because that would be silly. I mean, that'd be crazy. So we should just not have a nuclear arsenal. And, China would never invade the United, no countries will ever attack the United States because the United States, we have 300 million guns among the population. We've got a big enough military. So let's just close down all our military bases. Let's totally destroy our nuclear arsenal. Let's get rid of all that. It's like that flies in the face of, again, how states pursue security. It's about risk. It's about capability. It's about potential. If the United States has the capability to do a first strike on Russia and prevent a second strike with an ABM shield, that alone is an unacceptable security posture for Russia. I mean, how would you feel if you're a Russian citizen and it's like, well, I think the United States won't nuke me today. Like, that's just not good enough.
Can I ask a question?
Threat,
and then you can
go ahead.
Yeah,
sure.
Let's say that I actually grant all of that. Let's say that an ABM shield exists and we have first strike capabilities and we've totally nullified a second strike capability. Why does it matter if we have Ukraine then? Why can't all those missiles just come into the Baltics? What changes there? How far is the border from Latvia to Moscow?
You should ask the NATO then. I mean, I'm not the one that wants to.
Well, no, I'm asking you because you're telling me that we need to keep Ukraine out of NATO because I'm Russia and I need to shore my security interests. Okay, well, let's say
we should do neither of these things.
Well, no. You're describing how Russia acts. I'm just asking. Let's say this technology exists. Let's say the ABM, all our anti-ballistic missile platforms exist. We've eliminated second strike. Fuck, we could launch those missiles from fucking DC. Why would it matter at that point whether Ukraine is in NATO or not? How does that security interest square up at all with Russia's invasion into Ukraine?
Because both pose a security risk to Russia. I mean, I don't understand. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But both of these things are provocations because both upset the balance. And that's fundamentally what realism is about balance. So I'll answer your question. Creating an ABM shield, even though, and you don't even need to grant me that. It's that we're even working on it. You're right, because it's nowhere near completion. It's not effective, but it's that 20 years ago, we said, forget it. We're going to start to build this thing that Russia cannot build. It's a provocation. It upsets the balance. It upsets the confidence that Russia has, because that's really what it's about. Is if you have two adversaries, which are both powerful and distrustful of one another, it's about confidence in each other. And when the United States pulls out of this treaty, it disrupts the confidence that Russia can have in mutually assured destruction. Their confidence that the United States will never do a first strike because it would get annihilated. If
because
the United
of North
States
Korea and Iran, right?
Pursuing this tech, okay, but that does nothing for Russia. They could say that. I mean, they could say that, but the ABM shield works equally against Russian missiles as it does against Iranian North Korea. So, I mean, they could say that all day long. but the effective capability works equally against Russia. I mean,
It doesn't work equally though, because you can only intercept so many missiles. That's why both countries have
but they still shoot down missiles. They still shoot down missiles.
This is the question that like every high schooler asks, right? They're like, why are so many nukes in existence, Mom? We could nuke the whole world 50 million times over. Well, it's because you want to get through any of those hypothetical shields, right? A single ICBM can have a MIRV that has like what, like fucking 20, 30, 40 dummy warheads on it now. There's no possible way that you're intercepting thousands of these missiles, right? It's not like shooting down Palestinian bombs being lobbed into fucking Israel, right? These are really sophisticated weapons launching from all over the world, some from the Pacific, some from the Atlantic, in places we don't even know they exist.
Yeah, oceans. But this is fundamentally misdirection because, and again, that is what the United States said. They said, well, we're building this ABM shield for Iran and North Korea. Okay, but ABM agreement was signed between Russia and the United States. And that was the foundation of mutually assured destruction between Russia and the United States for 30 years.
Signed before North Korea.
By the way, hang on. Let's not interrupt each other. We had a good back and forth here. That it still disrupts Russia's confidence in the mutually assured destruction framework. Because I will grant you all of that. I agree with you. ABM is inadequate because it doesn't include China. ABM is inadequate because you do have rogue states seeking a nuclear arsenal. All of that being said, this does nothing to reassure Russia. I mean, because just as Russia says that, NATO promised Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand, it doesn't mean shit if it's not on paper. So the United States could say we're doing this for Iran and China and North Korea, but effectively they're still building an ABM shield, and it still does disrupt the confidence that Russia has. And so it upsets the confidence and the balance as far as the nuclear question is concerned. And the same is true of Ukraine. You're right. Do I think that NATO is going to invade Russia anytime soon? I mean, probably not. I don't think that would make much sense, but it disrupts the balance and it destroys Russia's confidence that something like that could not happen. Again, it relies on NATO's good faith. And good faith is not enough because regimes change, circumstances change, crises flare up, things happen in the world. And so what underlies a nation's security is its capability, its confidence, and those things come from offensive and defensive capability. They come from buffer states. They come from treaties and agreements. And so it's not enough to say, well, NATO's never invaded us before. They probably won't, launch those missiles at us from Ukraine and forever into the future. It's not an adequate guarantee. And that's the argument from the Russian side is if it's just not good enough for Russian security. And if no one's listening to them.
If we go through the realist perspective, I'm curious. If NATO membership was never floated directly on the table to Ukraine, would not Ukraine fall victim to Russia's sphere of influence anyway? Isn't that what realism would tell us? That irrespective of NATO expansion, we would expect a country to exercise authority, if it can, onto weaker powers surrounding their borders, meaning that none of this NATO shit even really matters anyway to Russia?
Well, that's really the crux of it, isn't it? Yes.
It kind of is, right? Yeah.
Yes. Well, but here, yes, Russia would exert influence over Ukraine, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, okay. Why talk about all the NATO bullshit, right? Obviously, they're going to do it anyway. And even security in the Black Sea, does it really matter if they have access to the Black Sea? They're not getting to the Mediterranean through fucking Turkey anyway, right? Where there are also nuclear missiles as well. It seems like all of the NATO shit is just like a smokescreen anyway.
No,
right?
but it's not then. It's not. That's exactly the point is, you're saying Ukraine would just be a buffer state. It's yeah, exactly. Ukraine should. NATO membership makes it a pro-Western country. Yes, it should, because the worst case scenario of Ukraine being a buffer state is that Russia will influence it. Who cares? Yes,
people of Ukraine, obviously.
Okay, powerful states influence weaker states. This is how states behave, and that is, in some sense, all
states behave. That's not true.
That is how great powers behave.
Why don't we invade Mexico? Do you think the
United States doesn't do this? Because we don't need to. Because we don't need to. We can. Are you seriously arguing that the United States doesn't influence Western Hemisphere countries? I mean,
influence is way different than right now. We have drug issues. We've got cartel issues that exist on our southern border. If we wanted to, dude, we could.
Now you're just being ridiculous.
Hold on, no. If we're taking the realist perspective, if a country like Mexico existed on Russian borders, do you think that Russian would say, yeah, we understand a lot of illegal immigrants coming here. Yeah, we know a lot of it is ran by cartels, but we're going to respect your sovereignty. We're going to let you guys forget. Do you think that Russia would take the same position towards Mexico as the United States would?
Let me just get this clear. Your position is that in an analogous way, in the sense that Russia influences Belarus and Ukraine, you're saying that the United States in that same way does not influence
Canada
Countries
and
in the
Mexico.
Western Hemisphere. Countries in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, I mean, like in South America, especially through the Cold War, yeah, you could probably.
No, I'm
make
talking about
arguments
today.
for that.
I'm talking about today.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Will we recognize and support? Well, here, I'm curious. Like, what? Educate me. I don't know much about South American history. What are like breakaway states that the United States has recognized and sent paramilitary groups to in order to defend these states? We've shipped off tons of U.S. passports. We've shipped off U.S. citizens in order to Americanize these places. Like, where has this happened in South America since the year 1991? That's comparable to what Russia has done in Georgia, in Transnistria, in Ukraine. Like, where are these things happening?
I mean, listen, if you're arguing that there's no Western influence in the Western Hemisphere, I
didn't argue that there's no Western
Hang on. Don't interrupt me. I know it. See, this is what you do. This is what you do.
Well, you're not answering my questions, but go ahead. Yeah,
but see, this is what you do. This is what you do. We're talking about a fundamental assertion here, which is how great powers act. And the fundamental assertion is, the United States influences weaker states. And then you get into, educate me about history. You're not answering questions. You're not answering. I'm interrupting you. It's like, if your assertion, I don't need to back that up. I refuse to do it. I refuse to back it up because it's preposterous to suggest that the United States does not influence weaker states in the Western Hemisphere or elsewhere in the world. Absolutely, they do. How about
they do? Yeah.
How about in Colombia? Were they back to coup there? How about in countries? I mean, we have Guantanamo Bay in Cuba against the interests of the Cubans. The idea that the United States does not influence states, that we bully them into the TPP, we bully them into all kinds.
We abandoned the TPP because of our own citizens.
Of course, we influence.
Do you think the existence of Guantanamo Bay?
We prevent Japan from having a military. We station our troops in South Korea. We influence Saudi Arabia all the time. We influence all Western Europe all day long. And so that's where you're sort of living in unreality, is where you say, Russia is the only country that behaves in this way. Russia cannot have and I think maybe this is the crux of the disagreement, is you think that, for Russia to have a sphere of influence over Ukraine, you literally say, well, we must do anything short of war to stop this Russian incursion. NATO membership must be on the table. All to prevent what? Russia having a reasonable sphere of influence.
All to prevent what we're talking about today. Do you think do you think that Japanese and South Korean citizens want the United States to leave in the same way that Ukrainian citizens want Russia to leave today? Do you think that's at all comparable?
Yeah, the Japanese,
really?
Yeah, absolutely. But even in Ukraine, half the population is pro-Russian.
The Japanese, who are begging for greater military presence when North Korea is doing crazy shit, when China is sailing ships through.
The Japanese want to rebuild their military. And certainly it is just as contentious in Japan as it is in Ukraine. The people in 2014 that wanted to join NATO wasn't even a majority. It was a plurality, not a majority, a plurality of people. So it wasn't even more than 50% in Ukraine. You act like, it's this hostile thing. It wasn't hostile. And by the way, when Yanukovych accepted the Russian deal as opposed to the EU deal, you could say, they were going to be embargoed. No, they could not replace Russian trade. They're dependent on Russian trade. These are the kinds of soft power ways that Russia influences a state. And by the way, half the Ukrainian population supports Russia. Yanukovych was the most trusted politician in 2010, and he was democratically elected. And International Monitor said, this was a model for a democratic election.
In one election, not earlier.
In 2010,
In 2010, he was, yes.
And so, you laugh at that, but the point is to say you're creating this false, you're creating this completely distorted reality where, Ukraine doesn't want Russian influence and Japan wants American influence. It's like, the picture's more complicated than this. It's about how states behave. And, Ukraine, some people in Ukraine want Russia. Some people in Ukraine want the West. Russia influences Ukraine, as is how states behave. You could disagree, that's not normative, that's not right. But Ukraine was a part of Russia for hundreds of years. Ukraine was governed by Russia for the past 100 years, even when it was administratively autonomous. And, for Russia to have a sphere of influence, this is what the United States must tolerate for peace and détente with Russia. In the same way that nobody challenges America's influence in the Western Hemisphere or in Western Europe or elsewhere in the world, and in these other countries. That's just, if you're going to disagree with that, you're just living in Candyland.
I to try to compare Russia's activities in Ukraine with the soft power that America exerts over the world, right? There's a reason why you're trying to say South Korea and Japan, they feel the same way, right? I asked you to show me that in Japan, and you could show me a few protests in Osaka because of dumb Marines on base or whatever. But the reality is that we know that military presence of the United States there is welcome far more than Ukrainians are welcoming military presence from Russia into Ukraine. I hate to use this word, but it's self-evident, right? And to pretend that realism versus, say, like constructivism is a better way to analyze how powers in the world work, when we look at how the United States treats members on its border, and we contrast that to how Russia treats members on its border, it obviously just, it's not a good way to analyze how countries behave, right? Russia has, as a constructivist would say, an iterative pattern of behavior with countries on its border. It's continued to act in such a way. And to say that Russia's hypothetical security concerns 30 years into the future justify the shelling of Ukrainian cities today, the destruction of Ukrainian cities, the murdering and the killing of Ukrainian civilians, that all of that is okay because Russia must have a sphere of influence. And when I ask why, it's because, well, so that NATO doesn't invade. And when I ask why, it's, well, because then Russia wouldn't be able to invade. I guess if we want to use a descriptive form of analysis, we can, but morally, normatively, what's right, I absolutely don't think that we should accept that a country like Ukraine has to cuck itself to Russia and become a vassal state just because of some hypothetical security concerns that Russia has because it can't play nice with the rest of the world.
See,
I think we're kind of like looping back and forth.
I think this is the crux of it. I really believe this is the crux of it because what underlies your whole worldview is this benign hegemon narrative. You know, again, you can call it constructivism, you can call it whatever you want, but it's this idea that, you know, when America exercises soft power, like, well, that's okay. And they want it. And when America exercises hard power, well, you know, it's justified or something. When Russia does it, well, you know, it's evil and they can't do it. And this is, you know, Ukraine's cucking themselves. It's like, this is how great powers behave. And let's take a look at NATO. You know, you say NATO's never been aggressive towards Russia. NATO's been aggressive towards other states. You know this. I don't even have to say it. It's as you say, self-evident. The United States invaded Afghanistan. The United States invaded Iraq. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There weren't. Why did the United States invade Iraq? Well, some would say, well, they invaded a foreign state. They genocided their population. They sought a weapon of mass destruction, et cetera, et cetera. You could say that they invaded Iraq because Saddam Hussein was a rogue actor. You know, they found the anthrax was BS. They were not harboring al-Qaeda. They didn't have the WMDs. We invaded Iraq. In 2011, NATO did regime change in Libya because they said the elections weren't free and fair enough.
Among other reasons, but...
What were the other reasons?
Among torturing and imprisoning political prisoners, among using chemical weapons against
national sovereignty. National sovereignty.
Well, there's some levels of national sovereignty that I guess we just don't accept. When you say
that, wait a second. So is national sovereignty
okay?
Wait. Is national sovereignty absolute or is it conditional?
It's obviously conditional on things like the Geneva Convention or international agreements, but also notice everything you said. Where has NATO exerted its power against? None of the countries that you mentioned were nuclear power.
Doesn't matter.
We're
talking about how great states act. Sure, we're talking about normativity. Right?
That's the opposite of normativity. It's descriptivity. But regardless, if we were to say that NATO should no longer expand, okay, that we're not going to do that anymore, what is the next stage? The next stage is every single non-aligned state in the world getting nuclear weapons. Is that the future that we want? The whole point of things like the Budapest Memorandum was we need less states to have nuclear weapons because the more people that have them, the more fucky things kind of get. So do we just say now that like, okay, well, every non-aligned state in, in Southeastern Europe or in the Middle East or in Africa or in South America, everybody just start getting nukes because, hey, if you got them, even if we tell you to get rid of them and we won't hurt you like we did with the Budapest Memorandum, we're still going to hurt you, right? Pivot. I don't think that's a stable future. I think that security situation is bad for everybody, Russia included.
Well, I'll address that in a sec, but I think that's a bit of a pivot, if you'll forgive me, because I want to explore this little, because the crux of your argument is, well, Russia violated Ukraine's sovereignty, which is an unforgivable sin, but you just said that NATO's intervention in Libya was justified because national sovereignty is conditional. So which is it? Is sovereignty conditional or is it absolute?
I don't think that sovereignty is necessarily absolute. If it was the case that like Ukraine was gassing its own citizens or committing horrible war crimes, I mean, there are forums that you can go through to exercise power against people that do that. You've got the United Nations, you've got NATO. There are organizations that can do that.
But who decides? Who decides?
I just said the United Nations or NATO. And the
NATO decides. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? So the NATO alliance, which is foreign counter to Russia, they can decide when sovereignty is suspended or not. Russia, when Russia says we're going to invade Ukraine for our vital strategic interests, that's not a good enough reason. Sovereignty is airtight. Oh, Libya tortured some people? Fuck sovereignty. We can intervene. We can do whatever. Oh, Saddam Hussein is doing some wonky stuff. We can invade.
Libya is your worst example, okay? Because sometimes NATO goes in at least without. Sometimes NATO will go in without UN resolution. Libya was so fucked that Russia and China abstained from the vote. They're part of the Security Council. They got a UN resolution to go into Libya. That's how fucked Gaddafi was.
Okay,
if you want to use an example, no, that is exactly the point. It was so fucked. Even they wouldn't defend you there. The point is
you
that there
yourself
might
acknowledge sovereignty is conditional. If it's conditional,
of course it's conditional. But
then it's about the terms.
But sure, it is about the terms. But the terms can't be that Russia is worried about a future hypothetical war. That's why I'm not just screaming at you over and over again. I'll get to that. I'm not screaming at you over and over and over again that Ukraine has sovereignty, and that's the only reason why they shouldn't be invaded, right? Russia doesn't have justification for invading Ukraine. The future hypothetical threats to Russian sovereignty can't be used as an invasion to another sovereign country that's not in violation of any UN resolution. That's not because it just doesn't, because that could be used to justify the invasion of almost any state in the world by any great power.
No, it can't.
Why not?
Because Russia wouldn't say Mexico is going to deploy surface-to-surface missiles that can hit us in 5 minutes, and a NATO base in the Black Sea displaces our Russian base. So no.
Sure, the United States could invade places in Venezuela.
It literally applies
Brazil
to two countries.
No, it could.
The argument that Russia is making applies to exactly two countries, George.
The United States could invade Cuba right now if they wanted to, using that.
Argument. Yes, and they would. And
we don't. So your realist perspective.
But they did. The Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs.
Legitimately didn't. That's why the Bay of Pigs failed. Right?
No,
the United States did not successfully invade.
They failed because they were incompetent, but they tried.
Because they were incompetent. The United States failed an invasion in Cuba because they were incompetent.
If Russia fails, are you going to say, oh, they didn't invade? If Russia fails in this Ukraine war, are you going to say, oh, well, that just didn't happen because it didn't work?
If the United States played by Russia's rules, we would invade Cuba right now. We already have, I think, Guantanamo Bay isn't.
No, because there's no Russian defensive alliance in Cuba, and there's no surface-to-surface missiles in Cuba.
That doesn't matter from your
Cuba's not talking about nuclear rearmament, and if they were, we would invade because we did in Bay of Pigs, and we almost went to nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That doesn't fit your realist perspective, Nick. Whether or not Cuba has those arms, I would just repeat back to you that strong nations seek to exert their influence over weak nations. Cuba is a weak nation next to the United States. Why don't we just invade them and take them over? That's what Russia would do.
Because they're not putting surface-to-surface missiles there. There's not a defensive alliance there. Cuba is pacified because Cuba is completely pacified.
No, you already admitted
Cuba poses no.
You already admitted to me that even if NATO was off the table, Russia would still seek to exert influence over Ukraine. It might even still take over Sevastopol. It might still, which might be taking Crimea, right?
In the same way that we influence Cuba, and
that's not the same way. We don't send militaries down there to take over ports in Cuba.
Okay, we don't. Now you're just trying to confuse here. Which is it? I mean, we're talking about Russia influencing Ukraine absent the military alliance. And now, I'm saying, well, they influenced Cuba, and you're saying, well, they're not invading. It's like, okay, well, Russia didn't invade until the defensive alliance was on the table and Crimea.
The defensive alliance was on the table until Crimea was taken over.
Because NATO membership was on the table after the Maidan. Hello? And 13 countries joined NATO in 10 years. So, once again, this argument falls apart because it rests on all these, just convoluted assumptions, like a security guarantee. Like Russia can count on our good faith. The United States doesn't influence weaker states. The Western Hemisphere isn't secured by the Monroe Doctrine. Like if Cuba became part of a Russian defense alliance, we wouldn't do anything. I mean, these are all just a series of self-evidently ridiculous conclusions. And it's like, you will not acknowledge that you have the moral standard that Russia's judged by is up here, and the moral standard that the United States is judged on is down here. We can invade, we can influence, we can do whatever. It's no big deal. We decide what sovereignty is. Russia invaded a sovereign nation. Hitler, he's a revanchist.
I've never said that. I'm not saying that at all. We were having such a good conversation. Why are you strong?
I'm being hyperbolic, of course, for the rhetorical device. But come on, Steve.
You would have been the one calling me Hitler in this argument.
You got to work with me here. You got to work with me. Your native Cuba. America would crush your native Cuba. What would the Cuban people think if the Americans crushed your native Cuba for trying to join a defensive alliance with Russia. You know they would do it. You know the Council on Foreign Relations would crush your native country, Cuba.
First of all, my native country is the United States. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska. Okay, cute. So regardless, I guess with the center closing, so your position is that the current Russian invasion of Ukraine is justified, and Russia has carte blanche to do whatever they need to bring that nation to heel because of hypothetical security threats in the future that may exist if Ukraine joins NATO.
Well, no, we're not talking about carte blanche. We're talking about.
So would you like condemn them for what's going on in like Mariupol today, or in any of the?
That's nonsense.
Yo, you don't believe any of it's real? There's reporting, there's photo. You think all of it is fake?
There was reporting. Hey, what happened to that nuclear power plant that was? Do you remember when you said that 2 weeks ago? You said they're attacking a nuclear power plant. It turned out that was total bullshit. Yeah,
I don't think it was total bullshit. They were like
Western media lies.
So just to be clear, what's on the table right now? So Mariupol is not cut off from like electricity, water, food, not cut off from humanitarian aid with hundreds of thousands. You don't think any of that is?
It's a war. This is the conduct of war.
Sure. So they have carte blanche to shell the city, to bomb theaters, to bomb hospitals, whatever. That's what they did in Aleppo, right? That's what they did in Aleppo. Every single hospital and every single FSA occupied area was bombed. So those people had nowhere to go except back to Assad. This is Russian strategy 101.
Blank check. You're saying it's not a blank check. They couldn't.
What they did in Grozny. That city was more destroyed than any other city in the world because they were frustrated that their military wasn't advancing fast enough. We're seeing the same thing happen today.
This is such a sad pivot. See, I mean, you lose on the fundamental point.
I'm talking on the actual. I'm just asking you if like they have the right to go in and conduct war and destroy as much of Ukraine as they need to bring them to heel because of potential hypothetical security threats.
If they wanted to destroy as much of Ukraine as they needed to, the war would look very different than it does right now. And you know that.
But it's taken a different term, a darker term.
Okay, see, but not, it's a limited military engagement, and as far as it is limited. Yeah. They're not attacking Poland. They're not attacking the Baltics. They're not.
Wait, and they're not.
Hang on. See why you need to interrupt? You need to interrupt because I tell the truth here. They're conducting a war. It's a war. Destiny, you know this. And yes, I support the war. Absolutely, I support the president, the new czar, Vladimir Putin. I support Russia. Absolutely. I support what's going on. And I think that it's defensible. I think that this is the most reasonable European war that has happened in the past 100 years. I think this is the most reasonable war in the 21st century. Absolutely. I think, and to give you a comparison, I think this is more justifiable than the American war in Iraq. I think this is more justifiable than the NATO intervention in Libya. I think it's more justifiable than the American war in Afghanistan, frankly. I think this is a completely reasonable conflict. And, you know, the argument seems to be like, well, war is always wrong. And like national sovereignty is the sacred thing, except for when it isn't, except for when war is justified, and except for when sovereignty is conditional. It's just that you arbitrarily decide the terms based on
they're not arbitrary. They're international
courts. Okay, the Western world system, right? I mean, when you talk about, they're international norms or something, invading Iraq wasn't based on international norms. The world opposed that. France didn't even support that, okay? France didn't even support the war in Iraq. But the United States pursued it and more people died in Iraq than have died in Ukraine.
So far.
We occupied Iraq for 20 years. And, there wasn't this boycott. There wasn't I stand with fucking Iraq, and nobody talked about Saddam Hussein's sovereignty. So, I mean, just give it a rest. I mean, America's a global hegemon. We project power globally, soft and hard power. Russia is a second-rate, regional power, and they're exerting influence in their region. Ukraine's not a part of NATO. There's no defensive alliance yet. I think it's reasonable. I think it's totally reasonable based on the things I laid out between the missiles, between NATO being a counter-Russian alliance, NATO outspending Russia like 12-1, more than, I don't know the math right off the top of my head, but more than 10-1, 1.2 trillion to 65 billion. Like, yeah, Russia has a right to be concerned about all these things: the confidence in mutually assured destruction, the theater support missiles becoming part of the U.S. military doctrine, NATO base in Crimea has a right to be concerned. It's a limited engagement, and I'm glad that this argument wasn't about Russia rebuilding the empire, because it's not happening. Notice how quickly it started out with like, Russia's rebuilding a collapsed empire to like, well, Russia does nothing to worry about if the ABM shield's being built. Russia's not, invading Iraq's totally legit, invading Libya, it's international conventions, because it would be preposterous to suggest anything like what the NATO Western media suggests, which is that Russia's rebuilding an empire. empire. We know they can't do that. We know they don't have the capability. He's been in power for 22 years. And what does he have? Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Donbass, Crimea, it's peanuts. You know, he lost Kazakhstan. He lost Ukraine. He lost all these countries. And people go, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Donbass. He lost all of Central Asia. And they've got and they spent 67 billion. We spent 820. And we go, they're the empire. They're the empire. They're the aggressors. They're the military hawks. You know, there's just, it's like, it's insane. I don't understand it, Destiny. Stephen, help me understand this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who half your points are even addressing at this point. You haven't really demonstrated that there is a legitimate security concern by Russia with Ukraine. You've admitted yourself that even if Ukraine didn't join NATO, they still might have the, from the realist perspective, good enough reason to invade Ukraine, take over Crimea, take over as much of Ukraine as they want, because that's just what big nations do. And if that is going to be the argument that you use, then by God, just like we've done with every other former Warsaw Pact state, or a lot of them, and just like we've done with other Eastern European countries, you know what? We should just draft Ukraine into NATO then, just for, if no other reason, to ensure Ukraine's sovereignty. This idea that NATO is an empire just like Russia, that the United States is hegemonic just like Russia. I mean, the difference is, and we've seen this clearly, is that at least people want to join the United States hegemony, as opposed to Russia that has to force itself with shelling civilian cities and invading places and cutting up oil if you don't agree with them, and trying to poison your elected officials with uranium and whatever other crazy shit Russia has to do to countries around it. I don't think that the pressure that NATO exerts on other countries to join them, when that pressure is, will protect you from Russia that will actually invade you and destroy you, I don't think that's legitimately at all comparable to the type of pressure that Russia exerts on other nations around it. And I certainly don't think that the realist analysis of Russia just wants to control countries is a good enough reason to allow Russia to invade any country they want. But
well, yeah, I mean, I think that's really the debate, is like, they want freedom. The Iraqis want freedom. America, the world wants.
No one is saying that. No one has used that argument.
The world wants
the Iraqi
American
people
hegemony.
didn't vote for the United States to come to that country.
Well, what do you say to that? Hold on, wait.
Hold on, wait. I'm curious. Do you think I would defend the war? Do you think I would defend the war in Iraq? Or are you arguing against a straw man now?
Well, no, I want to ask. Wait, hold on.
The difference is that the world wants American hegemony.
I'm saying that Ukraine and states that joined NATO were begging to get into NATO. Initially, we didn't even know. Absolutely, they were. And look at what's happening
Ukraine?
now.
Ukraine?
In Ukraine, not until they took over Crimea. That's when public opinion shifted, when it was on the table for them to seriously consider joining. And you know what? When you've got a superpower that decides to take over a huge peninsula in your country, and then decides to start funding separatist civil wars in the eastern part of your country, would you agree both these things have happened? Yes, that's not only did opinion shift, but also you have to keep in mind, Nick, logically, right? Most of the opposition to NATO came from Crimea. So of course, when you capture that part, and then you recognize breakaway states in the east that are all like majority, like
come from Eastern Ukraine,
Russians,
from Crimea.
Yeah, no shit, they're going to be massively pro-NATO when Russia starts invading the places that are the most opposed to it.
See, now you just have to distort the facts. I mean,
I'm not distorting any fact.
Yeah,
wait, hold on. Are you saying that Eastern Ukraine was more pro-NATO than Western
Are you
Ukraine?
saying? But you say, well, the difference is that the world beckons for, because you said America's not a hegemon like Russia. Because the difference is,
I said that joining NATO. I said literally joining NATO is not the same as Russia invading you.
Hang on, let me explain. Earlier, you said, well, America's not a hegemon like Russia, and the difference is that this is like an exact quote. You said they're not a hegemon like Russia because the difference is that these states want America. You said that they're begging for NATO, but they weren't begging for NATO since 2008. In 2008, that's when the conversation starts. And Germany and France oppose it. Germany and France
were only given the membership as path to membership. They weren't actually given. Yeah, of course.
Yes, but Germany and France, they agree with me. Germany and France in 2008 say this is too aggressive. For the same reason, they said this is going to provoke Russia. This is going to cause a crisis on the continent. And so all they can say, as you say, at Bucharest is, well, we recognize their aspirations. In 2008, Ukraine's not begging to join NATO, but they're acknowledging their aspirations. Sure. In 2010, Yanukovych is elected. It moved forward in spite of this. In 2014, it's not an election, it's a coup. It's a coup, which is not supported by the majority of the population. The
Absolutely what? The opposition leader was the one that rose to power afterwards.
No, it was not.
Yanukovych ran from the country.
No, it was not.
Because he ordered his police to shoot at his citizens.
Hang on. See, now you're interrupting because the majority of Ukrainian people did not support NATO membership. The
No,
majority in 24. No, you're wrong.
That's
on that.
correct. No, I'm agreeing with you. Not
okay.
until Crimea
Yeah.
was removed,
Okay.
which was where your most anti-NATO
Well,
population.
hang on. So in 14, they're not begging for it. Not even a majority supports it. And not even a majority supports Maidan. Not even a majority of Ukrainians support Maidan. Nevertheless, a pro-Western leader is installed, and they begin moving towards
Wait, what do you mean
west.
installed? He was the opposition leader. He was the next guy that was coming up. What do you mean? He didn't just come from nowhere.
Happens, yeah, okay. It's a coup, Destiny. It's not like somebody ran on a platform of let's join NATO. They overthrew the government.
Overthrew. He fled the country after he did because he was worried that he was going to be tried for fucking war crimes when his top started.
Is it democratic to have a coup, to have a violent revolution?
Why are you saying democratic when part of the reasons why he was protested so heavily is because he literally tried to pass like 10 anti-protest laws? That's not democratic either.
Destiny. When you overthrow the government, you're still
when the government makes it illegal to protest and starts killing protesters, that's not very democratic.
So what are our standards now? So what are our standards? If some people don't like something the government does, then elections. Now democracy is when the people overthrow the government because the government passed an anti-protest law. So which is it? Is it about what the people want?
I don't know
what
about
sovereignty or all these things conditional? It's apparently it's conditional.
Of course, everything is conditional. Like, why are you acting like Destiny? Are you saying that committing crimes against humanity will forfeit your sovereignty? Of course.
This is unraveling. Like, it's unraveling.
Nothing is unraveling at all right now.
Here it is. Like, here's why.
Tell me why.
Because you're the crux of your argument is you say like, well, when the U.S. exerts influence on Ukraine, that's okay.
There was Euromaidan was not a U.S. driven protest.
Okay, but the point, we're not talking about Maidan right now. We're talking about NATO membership. Okay.
No, we were just talking about Maidan and the coup.
No, we're going back. We're taking it a step back
to NATO membership.
You said the difference between American and Russian power is that the Ukrainian people want American power and the Russian people do not. You said America hegemony, they don't have hegemony because the Ukrainian people consent to it. They want it. They don't want Russia. But the conversation about NATO membership begins in 2008 when that is not the majority position.
And they don't join because they don't want to.
Okay, hang on.
Yeah.
And in 2014, it's still not the majority position.
And they still don't join because they don't want to.
Hang on. Why are you jumping the gun here? It's because you know what's coming.
What's coming?
You know what's coming. Because
when their minds change when Russia invades them, they're like, okay, we changed our mind. Now we want to join NATO. Is that supposed to be surprising?
This is so sad for you. It's so over for you.
I'm losing so high right now. Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, you are. Okay. Because you said they're begging for it. They're not begging for it. NATO is moving across Eastern Europe, and they're not begging for it. The majority doesn't support it. They're talking about it in 2008. In 2008, they're saying they're going to make Ukraine a NATO member state, and the majority don't support it. In 14, they're talking about, hang on, why do you keep interrupting me?
Wait, can you acknowledge?
I can't even complete.
You can't make somebody.
I can't even complete a thought.
You can't just make them a NATO state. They have to consent to join, right?
You guys have been good the whole time.
When they say they acknowledge the aspirations of Ukraine, I mean, they're saying they have designs on Ukraine.
What does that mean? Ukraine has to consent to join, right?
Okay, so in 2008, if the majority don't support, why is the United States, against the wishes of Germany and France, talking about Ukraine being a NATO member?
I'm saying in Ukraine.
No, in 2008, why is the United States saying we recognize their aspirations if the majority don't support it?
Because they can recognize their aspirations. Ultimately, it still has to be approved by every NATO member. Come on.
Obviously.
No, I'm asking you.
Why would they say that? They're not begging for it in 2008. So why is the United States saying
how is that relevant? It doesn't change the fact, Nick, will Ukraine join NATO against Ukraine's will?
No.
Okay. Will Ukraine be taken over by Russia against Ukraine's will?
No.
That's the difference. Yes, of course, Nick.
No.
What do you mean no? Then why is there a war right now? What are we fighting over?
What you're arguing is that there's a principal moral difference, a normative difference in how the United States exercises influence as compared to Russia. But this is not the case. Because in 2000, Israel, and by the way, and you yourself said, the United States was pushing more strongly about Ukrainian NATO membership. They watered down what they said at Bucharest in 2008 at the behest of the Germans and the French. They watered it down for NATO to say, we recognize their aspirations. They weren't begging for it in 2008, but yet this was the conversation. That was a diluted proposition, was we recognize the aspirations. And then in 2014, the government is overthrown by a coup that is not. And in 2014, the majority does not support NATO membership. And in 2014, the majority does not support the Maidan. So your argument rests on this idea on two things, that Russia violated sovereignty and Ukraine has a right to self-determination. But both of these things are in doubt now, because now you're saying, well, the coup, it doesn't matter that the coup wasn't a democratic election because, well, Yanukovych did an anti-democratic thing. And even though the coup that wasn't popularly supported by half the population, it wasn't an election, overthrew him and installed the pro-Western leader. Oh, well, it doesn't matter at all. It's like, okay, so which is it then?
But all of
self-determination and national sovereignty both appear to be completely conditional.
I don't know
because it's a coup-backed government that creates the crisis in Crimea. And it is, national sovereignty, which you say is conditional and apparently determined by NATO. So, that's where the argument falls apart here.
Okay,
to put it simply,
you keep saying that it's a coup-backed government. The government had popular support post-revolution. Or
was it elected? Was this a?
They held elections afterwards, and who kept winning? Pro-Western leaders.
But that's not the constitutional process, is it?
So so now the constitutional process. I mean, wasn't it voted on by every member of parliament afterwards? Didn't they take a vote in parliament after Yanukovych left? Did they not? Was that not the constitutional process?
No, there's no constitutional provision for a revolution, obviously. I mean, would you say that if on January 6th, if the Republicans overthrew the government and then the Congress voted for Trump, would you say, oh, yeah, that checks out? Yeah, that's legitimate. Of course not. Of course not.
If it seemed like the majority of the United States supported it, if Trump held an election afterwards and he won the election, then yeah, I mean, probably it seems like, it's still a form of coup or revolution, but to pretend that it would be like a more apt comparison is you're trying to make it sound like Trump, at the very least, like him or hate him, had massive popularity in the United States, right? It's not like Trump was like an installed leader. Let's say that Trump did win that after a quote unquote coup. Would you call Trump an installed leader after a coup? Probably not. You would probably be here making the argument, well, Trump enjoys wide support from the majority of the United States. Yeah, but your realist analysis
You're
sucks.
the liberal.
Nobody uses realism. Nobody cares about realism. Nobody uses these arguments. It doesn't matter.
You believe?
Okay?
Oh no, it does matter because I'm a realist.
It absolutely doesn't.
I would say advantage. Is good. Whatever is good for America is good. You would say, as the liberal, well, it wasn't.
Hold on, wait. I haven't even finished responding. You cannot call it a coup. Okay, when they formed a temporary government, when they had elections later that year, and they allowed all the elections to play out. That's exactly what happened, and they had it with the support of the parliament and the support of the people the entire time. You can try to cry and say it was installed or CIA led or whatever, but the reality is that Ukraine had democratic processes working throughout the entire time. Does it suck that Yanukovych left after having police assassinate people in the street? Yeah, I guess that does suck. So maybe there was some.
It was a coup. So your argument goes something. Let me just paraphrase your argument so far. America does not influence weaker states. Maidan was not a coup. And there was no security threat to Russia posed by surface-to-surface missiles in Ukraine.
Okay.
Oh, okay, yeah, it's all, it sounds legit to me. Yeah, that checks out. Maidan was a revolution.
Now we're in the make up what other people say phase. So I think we've hit rock bottom on this argument now.
People can discern for themselves. People can discern. I mean, that seems to be the argument. Russia has no legitimate security threat by shield and the surface-to-surface.
You even admitted that even sans NATO, they would still invade Ukraine. So it seems like you agree with that as well, yeah?
Okay, sure.
All right, now, we could, I'm going to look through here and see if we have some questions from Super Chat and stuff like that. I guess if you guys want to put a capstone on each of your presentations here first before maybe I go to that might work too. I don't know. It's up to you guys. Or do you want me to just look for questions?
I think a closing statement would be in order.
Yeah, and then I'll do questions after, right? So you guys can have your presentation down pat. Okay, so go ahead. I think, I don't recall fully, but I think it was Destiny that led off, right? So, okay, so that would be you leading off here then, and then Nick.
No, let Nick lead off here. I led off with you.
No, you.
Oh, no,
I'm not going to give you the final word on the opening statement and the last word. Are you serious?
Well,
it usually rotates.
Hey,
or we can do
normative laws
at the same time.
The normative law. You're invading this debate. You're suspending normative.
Well, it's because you got the lead off.
Sovereignty in this conversation, so you have to decide which hegemonic influence.
Well, it's because you had the lead off. I mean, I wasn't trying to
Sovereign Ralph
stack the deck either way. That's the only reason. I just thought that was the normative rules, kind of that you should have the first on the closing since you had the first debate. I mean, if you really want to close, I mean, it's fine.
I really want to close, but he does too. So now we have a conflict here that you have to resolve, Ralph.
Well, you know what? If I had a coin.
Being first is a privilege and being last is a privilege. Usually the person that goes first in the opening goes first in the end.
I'm looking for. I don't actually have.
He's looking for a UN Security Council resolution.
Pull up Robert's rules. Robert's rules of order. Let's go. Let's check them. Let's check them.
I thought I had a coin around here somewhere. Surely to
let's
God.
post E to support Ethan Ralph's war.
You would think I could go downstairs and actually flip a coin. You know what? I'll go downstairs and get a quarter if you want.
Ethan's campaign to Richmond.
And that's
E.
That's so fucked that I don't have any coin here. Like you would think. Okay, can you guys argue for a couple more seconds while I go get a coin? Because
I'll just go first. I mean, it's not even appropriate, but I'll go first. I mean,
yeah,
Ukrainian citizens have the same resiliency that I have.
If he's willing to cede that, I mean,
repelled the attack. You repelled.
Yeah, okay. If you're willing to see
my
that,
generals have been killed. I'm encountering the ghost of Cuba, the ghost of Havana.
Thank God, he flies over the sky, shooting down cozy TV streams one at a time.
This ghost of Omaha is destroying my capabilities. Ugh.
All right, go ahead then. Go ahead.
I'm so mad. Okay, all right. So in closing, I think that was basically a nice summary enough. Just at the end there. And I don't want to go too long, but the crux of the argument is this. America is not a benign hegemon. America is the world superpower. And with NATO is a hyperpower still. $1.2 trillion in military spending, more sophisticated capability than anybody can recognize. And all it takes is to put yourselves in the shoes of the Russians and in Moscow to understand where Russia is coming from. The suspension of the ABM Treaty in 2001, the suspension of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019, these in themselves are dramatic provocations. The reintroduction of theater support missiles into Europe destabilizes the balance of power. And that is, of course, notwithstanding the largest concern, which is the continued expansion of NATO since 1999. NATO is an explicitly anti-Russian alliance. It's formed to contain Russia and principally to contain Russian influence and power. After the Soviet Union dissolved and Russia became weaker, NATO remained and expanded. And now it's expanding on Russia's borders, compromising its vital strategic interests, its naval base in Crimea, its Black Sea Fleet, and the territory of Ukraine. You know, what NATO membership for Ukraine entails is surface-to-surface missiles, which can strike Russia in 5 minutes. It entails a tripwire in Ukraine that is right on Russia's border. It entails NATO domination of the Black Sea. And ultimately, this is about NATO and American domination of its adversaries and no concession given to its adversaries that they might have legitimate security interests. They might have legitimate interests as powerful states and all, and recognizing that and negotiating with them and working with them towards an equitable security arrangement. That's what we're talking about here, is an equitable and fair security arrangement. Destiny has talked about sovereignty, which, of course, we know the United States considers conditional. When Russia invades Ukraine, it's a gross violation of sovereignty. But when we invade Libya, Iraq, and bomb other countries, of course, these exceptions are valid. It's called right to protect. We can fabricate this out of thin air. We say that Ukraine has a right to self-determination, but it is true that the United States backed the Maidan Revolution. That could be disputed, but nevertheless, we support that government. We've given billions of dollars in assistance to that coup government, and we've supported that coup government's aspirations to join NATO. So once again, self-determination appears to be somewhat conditional. And then what's more fundamentally about all of this, this is a bad outcome. This is a bad outcome that nobody wanted. How did we arrive here? What were the root causes and the precipitating causes? Let's even just be fair and say, at the minimum, we have to recognize that the United States has played a role in this. To say that it is all Russian revanchism belies the military imbalance, which is very real. It belies Russia's capabilities and the fact that in 22 years of rule, Vladimir Putin has not taken over any countries, invaded any sovereign countries. It was in response to the 2014 crisis and in response to the suggestion that Ukraine might go nuclear and join NATO that Russia invaded Ukraine. How did we arrive here? We have to look at our own role. We have to look at our own role in disrupting the mutually assured destruction confidence with the ABM and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty withdrawal. We have to recognize our role destabilizing other countries around the world with NATO aggression. We have to recognize our role in expanding NATO in a way that Russia's repeatedly said makes them uncomfortable, and even where they've drawn red lines. And so, if my victory condition in the debate is merely for people to say NATO played a part and Russia has some valid interest here, I think we cover that. I think I won on those grounds. The other side has to say that America is a benign hegemon. The world wants American power. The world invites American power. American power is innocuous. Russia has nothing to fear. Russia has no valid concerns. It's just run by a corrupt despot who's only using security concerns as a pretext for territorial ambitions. I think throughout the debate that was made, I think from the outset, that was conceded not to be true. So that's my closing statement. America is not a benign hegemon. This is a limited, reasonable military engagement, certainly more reasonable than the things NATO has done in this century. And I support Russia. Go Russia! We salute the brave soldiers, the Moscow's finest, the Tsar's finest, as they liberate Ukraine from the Western dogs. So that's my closing statement. Z.
I will concede the entire debate to Nick of whether or not America is a benign hegemon. Unfortunately, that is not at all what we came here to talk about today. I understand that when Russia is in the process of invading another country, they very much want to center the conversation about Russian-American relationships or about the sovereignty of the United States or the sovereignty of Russia or the way that these two superpowers act. But that is not what the discussion is about today. It's whether or not Russia's invasion into Ukraine can be justified. We can bring up as many defeated talking points as we want. I'm used to people doing it over and over and over again. We can talk about how the suspension of some ABM treaty magically destroys second strike capabilities, even though when Nick was pushed, he admitted that an ABM silo cannot become an ICBM silo. He admitted that Putin was allowed access to these silos by Biden if he wanted to investigate. He admitted that this technology that Putin is so worried about doesn't even exist yet. It might not be here for 10, 20, or 30 years. And he admitted that if this technology was so threatening, who cares? We could install it just as easily in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, down in Turkey. If we wanted to nuke Russia from anywhere, if we wanted to encircle Russia from anywhere, if we wanted to have ABM silos around the world that could intercept an infinite amount of MIRVs, an infinite amount of ICBMs, we could already do it. We don't need Ukraine to do that. Just like Nick already admitted that even if Ukraine never even had an accession plan to NATO, Russia, in the realist perspective, would just invade them anyway. They have a right to it. Why? Because of strategic interest in the Black Sea that Turkey is constantly threatening anyway. Controlling Sevastopol doesn't get them through Istanbul, doesn't get them into the Mediterranean. There isn't even a good strategic reason around the world why Russia would have access to these ports, how it would help them. And the idea that capturing Ukraine, the idea that Russia invading Ukraine is representing the same threat to their sovereignty as Ukraine democratically choosing to join the NATO alliance, the idea that America is this benign hegemony and they've never done anything and blah, 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 that's absolutely not true. I've never said it. But there is the fact that there is an old Eastern European saying that if you call for America, America will come. If you call for Russia, Russia will come. And if you call for no one, Russia will come. There is something to be said for the fact that these countries, whether we're talking the Baltics, whether we're talking Poland, Romania, any Southeastern Europe, there is the fact that these countries are looking towards NATO and they want to join NATO. Their citizens are voting to join NATO. We can't even accept just one or two at a time. It always have to be in batches of 3, 4, or 5 because we don't want to accept only one because it'll cause conflict in the countries because people are so desperate to get into our military alliance. And the only thing that Russia has done with their continued aggression into Ukraine has proven today more than ever a good reason why that alliance still exists. And that's to ensure the security of your country if you are not willing to pursue a nuclear arms program of your own. So I would prefer a world where NATO expands to include more countries than the world that Nick advocates for, where Russia has justification to invade anybody they want. And the only successful path forward, if you are a smaller country, is to acquire nuclear weapons of your own.
All right, now there are several questions here. Thank you both, gentlemen, here for participating. I didn't have to do much. I just kind of let two old pros go at it, right? And that's how I prefer it, honestly. I feel like too many times the moderator kind of gets too involved here. It's best to just let the two participants go at it. But I saw this last question just popped up actually, and I don't know how many more I'll ask since both you've been generous with your time. But do either of you think we are actually in danger of a World War III type situation? I'll start with Nick since Destiny was just talking. But I definitely want to hear what Destiny has to say about that too. But what do you think, Nick?
Yeah, we certainly are. And, is it imminent? I mean, who's to say? The problem is that, whenever you've got these disputes between great powers and nuclear powers, it's always a risk. And the biggest concern is people don't take it seriously. Honestly, when people say there's no threat of World War III, that's actually when World War III is the most likely, because it's people's assumption, it's people's confidence. Like, oh, that'll never happen. That's really what brings it about. So I don't think it's likely. The United States won't impose a no-fly zone. Russia's not going to attack NATO. So, I don't think it's likely. But you don't like to see this kind of conflict. You don't like to see Russia or the United States being invited to impose a no-fly zone over a country that Russia's invading. So certainly we're closer to it now than we were 4 weeks ago.
All right, go ahead, Destiny.
I think that Biden has done a really good job at being responsible about dictating the exact terms to how the United States would participate in this war. It doesn't surprise me that that Ukraine would be crying for a no-fly zone, that they want U.S. troops on the ground. Obviously, I would expect him to ask for it. He should, as the leader of that country. But I mean, it's pretty clear that the United States has been pretty responsible in its terms of engagement. We'll do what we can, from afar, but we're not going to have troops on the ground there. We're not obviously going to be imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Hopefully, we're never going to have a situation where U.S. troops and Russian troops are crossing swords with each other, or U.S. Planes are shooting at Russian planes or anything like that. And I mean, as long as it continues to be managed like that, and as long as Putin's scope of engagement is limited, as Nick would say, to just Ukraine, ideally that is something that never comes to pass. I don't think that anybody, even Putin, wants like that type of conflict.
What do you think about Zelensky in general?
I hate Zelensky.
What an amazing leader. Oh my God. Stays in Kyiv, is with his soldiers, posting on TikTok, dancing to save Ukraine. What a great Kyiv. That's right. That great Ukrainian capital.
Yeah.
I think he's a great guy. Did a TV show about how he'd be a great president, and now he's fucking president today. You'd think that you, a Trump supporter, would fucking love the guy.
He's a puppet.
I think Zelensky has done an amazing job. He's doing a really good job. I wish the best for him.
I was wondering because
if he survives his conflict, Putin has made the dude a fucking national hero, which is good. Maybe they can worship somebody that's not a fucking ex-Nazi now for once in Ukraine. People don't have that argument to use against
I want to answer your question. Zelensky is a Western puppet and a dog. He's a puppet of the Eastern Ukrainian mafia. And, he's caused this whole thing. This is an unwinnable war. Okay. Russia's going to steamroll Ukraine. He's just getting people killed. Very serious. He conscripts the entire adult male population. You can't leave. He's dooming them to die for a cause that is lost. So I think Zelensky sucks, and I think if you like him, you're gay. And I hate the whole situation. I support Russia. I hope he gets put in jail forever or worse. I hope that Russia puts him in jail forever or worse, because that's what he deserves.
I see a chat here. Destiny, let's talk about Western aggression. Russian forces found 30 biolabs on their border in Ukraine with weaponized diseases. The NWO was preparing, not Hollywood Hogan, by the way, or Scott Hall, but the other NWO. The NWO was preparing to exterminate Russia with Russians, I guess, with a bioweapon. And he ends it with an insult.
I mean, this is all bullshit. And I think Nick knows it. And that's why he was smart enough not to bring any of this up. I mean, the United States the United States funds research labs all over the world. I mean, especially in the wake of the coronavirus, we have research labs all over the place that are doing research on deadly pathogens. I mean, it's part of what we want happening around the world. You don't want countries managing this stuff with no foreign oversight. We want to be able to share our intelligence. We want to be able to share our biological understanding with these labs to make sure they're conducting research in safe and effective ways. The idea that there exists some top secret bioweapons labs in Ukraine to target fucking Russian DNA, that's even possible. I know the Russian State Department has tweeted out some wild shit, but I'll hold my breath until some actual evidence of these insane fucking fox-die bioweapons come out of any Ukrainian labs. And I think it's a little bit sad if you're a person, you do think it's good that all biological research around the world should be contained with its own country without sharing any intelligence, any resource, or anything with anybody else. It's just not how bio research works today in the world.
Go ahead.
I just think that's so funny. I mean, I hope that people see the kind of Western hubris on display. It's there's this concession that these biolabs studying deadly pathogens are there in Ukraine, but it's once again, it's sort of hand waved away. We do research all over the world. This is just what we do, folks. It's unconscionable to imagine Russia or China.
We have these labs in China.
The shoe on the other foot stuff. It's if China, hang on, I didn't interrupt you. If China had a biolab in Canada studying deadly pathogens, would we be
China funds grants and has students that go back and forth between U.S. biolabs and Canadian ones? Of course.
Why do you have to interrupt me? Is it because your argument
just
is
lying?
Because your argument is so weak that even just by me talking obviously disputes it. It's just like this total, you're just so naive to say like the West doesn't have designs on other countries. It's totally innocuous. That's no big deal. That's just Russian propaganda. It's like, it's intolerable that would be occurring in Ukraine, right on Russia's border, our number one chief adversary. It just makes no sense. I mean, no state would tolerate this.
Do you think so? Do you think that China doesn't fund or send students or intelligence to any other labs in Canada or the United States?
We're not talking about the same thing here.
Okay.
Well, what Chinese biolabs studying deadly pathogens are you talking about?
We don't know any of them because we don't talk about them. China funds labs all over the world, just like we fund labs all over the world. We'll look at the Wuhan Institute.
You're fabricating that out of thin air.
Okay, well,
in Wuhan?
People can go.
Wuhan Institute in Wuhan, in China?
That we, have had grants and funding go towards. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that China knows about, and it's in their territory. It's not a secret facility on their border.
Wait, none of these were secret in Ukraine. These are well known about. What are you talking about?
Oh, please. As far as the
some of these labs have existed since the Soviet era. Yeah, what do you mean?
Yeah, and we lied about their intention. So, we were decommissioning them. Oh, really? We were decommissioning
we didn't
them.
Know. We recommended they be decommissioned, but apparently Ukraine didn't follow through. But we had to
fabricating stuff. Well, China does in the U.S. No, they.
Oh, you can go. You can Google it if you want. Chinese funding biolabs overseas. Okay. You can go look it up if they want. Yeah.
Right.
All right, now let's see here. I have a final question too, but I see a couple super chats came in. Let's see. How does Destiny reconcile his undying love of sovereignty with other? No, I'm not gonna read that one. I just now saw the end of it. I see how it took a turn there that I did not see.
What was it?
Oh well, I got
sovereignty of my fucking wife.
It actually did. Yeah, that's literally what happened. Like I did.
Yeah, there you go. I don't know how I saw that one coming. I just have a way to see the end.
I was mid sentence, and then I was
trying
to. There's some aggression on your wife.
Yeah, that got out of hand. Is Russia Voldemort or Dumbledore? That's another one that came in. Sorry, forgot my name in the question for Destiny. What was the question that you had? When will Russia get Netflix back? Russia are missing their LGBTQ content. Is that the one? Is that the question that you had, or was it the Voldemort or Dumbledore? I don't know if you want to answer that. I had a final question though, and I'll start with you, Destiny. Where do you see this thing headed? Like, where's this gonna? I mean, there will be some kind of resolution eventually there in Ukraine. So,
initially, all the military analysts said that the prediction was that this war would be over pretty soon. I think people were saying like within 2 weeks, Kyiv would probably fall to Russia, but apparently I don't know, I'm seeing like a ton of different reasons why Russia's military aggression has failed so far up to this point, whether it's due to lack of maintenance, lack of training, lack of planning, more resistance in Ukraine than they thought. I've heard that NATO intelligence sharing in Ukraine is assisting them more than they thought. Weapons from Turkey maybe is assisting them more than was previously thought. But I don't know at this point. I still imagine Ukraine probably falls soon, but I think that the more protracted the conflict gets, the worse it probably looks for Russia, both at home domestically and probably internationally. But who knows? We'll see.
Mr. Fuentes, what do you think? Where's it going to go?
I think it's already over. I think Ukraine has been flattened. They're decimated. Russia will win the war. And I think the outcome, I don't think that Russia will try to annex Ukraine. I don't think that Russia will even try to occupy all of Ukraine. I think that Russia will simply ensure that Ukraine does not join NATO. I think they'll probably install a pro-Russian government. Maybe they'll annex, Novorossiya. They'll annex its area of Russia. They'll annex the whole Black Sea coast and connect with Transnistria and maybe the Donbass, everything east of the Dnieper River. I think that's probably as much as they do, and even that I think would be. That would probably be more, but I was surprised by the invasion, to be honest. So maybe they'll go that far. But so I think that's where it's headed. I think that Russia will remain ostracized from the international community. I don't think that's a good thing. I think that it's in America's strategic interest to pursue a détente with Russia and then ultimately work with Russia on things. Instead, we've kicked them out of the system. Kick them out of the dollar system. This will have consequences for decades. It's not, the US dollar is not going to be replaced overnight, but it will have a ripple effect throughout time as China rises as a peer competitor to America. So, all in all, even if you're pro-America, this is bad for America. The whole situation's a big blunder for America, and it's our fault.
Destiny, tell people where to find you, sir.
Twitch.tv/Destiny, YouTube.com/Destiny.
Mr. Fuentes, tell people where to find you as well.
Cozy.tv/Nick. Well, hey, wait, before we go, hey, just want to say, hey, thanks, Ethan, for hosting the debate.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Destiny. You know, Destiny, you're all right. You know, compared to Hassan and Vosh and these
Wow,
other
we're
guys.
setting the bar pretty low there, but
Yeah, no, but you're real. I watch these other debates and I'm like, you know what, this Destiny guy doesn't seem too bad compared to these guys. So I give you my official endorsement, official Nick Fuentes thumbs up, white nationalist, sarcasm, seal of approval, endorsed by a far right guy. You know, we like that you're coming around. We pursue a detente. One day you and I will be fighting side by side. You'll come around one of these days, Destiny. You'll be
okay. I want to ask.
You're already halfway there.
Can I ask you a real question? I'm actually super curious. Okay, I think I might know the answer, but I'm curious. Okay, so if you and I am going to admit I don't follow as much of all the politics. I watch some of your conference thing, whatever, right? But if you're like an America first guy, that's a big thing for you. Mm-hmm. Let's say that all the arguments you were making about like American hegemony and everything is like true, that NATO is expanding American power and influence over the world, et cetera, et cetera. Why wouldn't you be advocating for that in kind of like a neoconservative kind of way, that NATO should be expanding and bombing countries and exerting U.S. influence everywhere? Why would you advocate more on the Russian side of this conflict?
Well, so there's two ways. It works in two ways. Number one, even if I was the State Department, I would still say it was bad, because you can get too greedy. And this is what Russia says about, you should watch the Oliver Stone, I don't know if you've seen this, but the Putin interviews, you know, you might think it's propaganda, but it's actually interesting. And he says, you know, what the problem is that America emerges from the Cold War thinking they could do anything. They defeat the Soviet Union, they emerge as the undisputed power, and they say, we can do anything that we want. We have unlimited power and we can do whatever we want. And he says, you know, then we're no longer forced to be strategic. You know, you understand, this is moral hazard. We think we could do anything, and then we're given to making mistakes, and we're given to hubris and greed. And so I think the balance is in our interest as well. I think that, because look at what we've done. I'm not the first person to say this, but we've pushed Russia into the arms of China. China is our peer competitor in this century. What we should be doing is forming as many alliances. If I'm the neocon, I want to form as many alliances against China as possible. Russia and China are natural adversaries, not allies, because they're in competition in Central Asia. And they're border each other in Eurasia. So and Russia's a second-rate power. It's called triple diplomacy, like Nixon did. Nixon played China, then a second-rate power against Russia, the USSR, the peer competitor. We should do the same in this century with Russia as a second-rate power.
Yeah. So here's a question. Okay. So my understanding is there were kind of talks with Yeltsin, but there were definitely talks with Putin, and especially during the war on terror, the United States started to take a bit of a more cooperative relationship with Russia. And I didn't study as much for this part, but I feel like at one point, I think there was an open offer for Russia to consider joining NATO. But I think Putin didn't like the idea of it because he wasn't going to apply and go through the normal channels. He thought that Russia should be given special treatment. So it seems like, and I understand there's a stark difference between Cold War era U.S. foreign policy and post-Cold War era, where, not to say that it's perfect, obviously situations like Iraq and arguably Afghanistan pop up, but it's been largely, I think, a bit more responsible than prior to that. It seemed like there was space for Russia to consider some sort of ascension into like this Western hegemonic sphere. Like, do you not think that was possible, or do you think that they shouldn't consider it, or that's just completely impossible now, or what?
I think it was impossible because I think America, well, and this is what Putin says, you have to go to the source, because we can assume his intentions, and of course what he says is rhetoric, but we can parse out what his analysis based on what he says.
Sure.
And what he says is that the United States doesn't want partners, it wants vassals. It does not want Russia to have sovereignty in the true sense and independence in the true sense and have its own independent policy. It wants Russia to be like Germany, France, or the UK in the sense that they just sort of follow what the US says. That's what Russia says. Now, Putin also says that he said to Bill Clinton in 2000, he said, maybe Russia could be a part of NATO. And Bill Clinton said, oh, yeah, maybe. But what Putin also alleges is that in the Chechen war, the United States was talking to Chechen separatists and even Chechen terrorists. That's the Putin claim. And Putin says that he brought that up with George Bush, and George Bush said, oh, I'll kick their ass when I find out who did that. And it went on. And then also, you do have the ABM thing, you do have the other things. And by the way, like Putin was cooperative with the West. Like Putin allowed the West to use Tajikistan as a base to send troops into Afghanistan in 2001. Russia was the first country to call George Bush after 9/11. So there was this cooperation, but I think that soured. And, your side would say, well, that's because Putin's like this evil dictator. I mean, I'm sorry if,
go ahead. Yeah.
Well, that's the NATO rhetoric. But the Putin side says, well, America wanted to subordinate Russia, and Russia didn't want that. And when Russia didn't want that and chafed at that, America didn't really care. And America just, it's unfortunate that it's out, because I think that would have been the ideal arrangement. But I think that America wants to control everything. They're too greedy. They're too prideful. They want to control everything. And this actually backfires on America ultimately, even if you're the State Department.
Do you not think there might be an argument that Russia doesn't want to join NATO? Because I don't buy the arguments of you're somehow forfeiting your sovereignty to NATO, when you've had countries within NATO that abstain from joining NATO-led invasions because of disagreements. You've got France, who's famously and historically been pretty NATO skeptic, where they've even driven down their support, I think it was 2010. They finally fully recommitted to NATO operations. So, I don't feel like Russia's sovereignty would be threatened as much. It feels more like they want to be that multipolar world. They want to be the other world order. Not I don't mean that in a dictatorial, evil, bad guy sense, but just that it feels like Russia is one of the only countries in the world that can rival the United States in terms of recent military history, nationalism, that sense of pride and honor, and, being the enemy and Rocky and all of that, having the big country. It feels like it's that kind of sense, that there is some unique cultural aspect of Russia that doesn't need to just be partnered with the rest of the world, but deserves its place on a pedestal next to the US, is what it feels like.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that is what Putin wants. Putin wants Russia to be a world power again. But I guess where I disagree is I think there's nothing wrong with that. That's what it means. Russia is a great power. Putin wants Russia to be a great power. And what that entails is a great power has its own agenda. It has its own interests. It has its own engagements. And a great power can cooperate with another great power, but it's not going to be subordinated to the American-led world. And this is how the continent of Europe was throughout the 19th century. It was settled through diplomacy. It was settled through negotiations. There was ironically a Crimean War was the only major continental war in that time. But that's what I think, and that's I think where the world is going. Like it or not, it's a multipolar world order. And Putin has the leverage, and the country's paid the price to exert its independence, but that's what they want. And the United States is unwilling to accept competitors. And the thing is, I don't think it's up to us. I think that Russia is a competitor. Putin wants to be a competitor, and so they are. And this is a practical reality that, like it or not, we have to deal with. Instead, we want to pretend that reality isn't real or try to contain that, and we can't contain Russia. It's just as evidence in Ukraine. We cannot contain them without a tremendous cost to both of us. So
do you think that if we perceive, and I'll if this, because I understand maybe you won't agree on some of these descriptive grounds, but if we perceive Russia to be authoritarian, dictatorial, a little war crimey, will level cities if they don't agree, even within their own borders, et cetera, et cetera. If we agree to that, do you think that it's possible that the United States might perceive itself as having some moral right to be the leader of the world, that the United States might perceive itself as saying our ruling is more righteous than what Russia's ruling would be, that the alternative that we provide and the fact that other countries seek to join, and I'm not trying to get you, I'm asking you to say if those things are true, because I'm sure you might understand, or you might say the United States committed some of those crimes. But do you think there's any world where the United States has that perception that they do have that kind of right to push itself in to the Western world more than Russia does?
No, and I think that's what sovereignty means. Sovereignty means that you get to govern your country how you want, and the sovereign gets to decide. And in Russia, the sovereign is Putin. And so and you talk about the worst things like the war crimes and so on. Well, that's just it. Sovereignty means you get to make those determinations. The United States tortures people in Guantanamo. The United States does torture. Does Russia say, I think it's against decorum for a nation to even discuss the domestic affairs of another nation. It's very, that is just not appropriate in international affairs. It's not respectful of sovereignty. But the United States, and that's why people resent the United States, because the United States goes finger wagging in every country's business. Oh, the Uyghurs. Oh, what you did in Chechnya. Oh, what you did here. And America's going to be the arbiter. And it's okay, but that's just really not appropriate, because Russia has a very different history than the United States. And the Chechnya thing was a brutal war. Look at what the Chechen terrorists did. The theater hostage situation and some of the bombings they conducted, that was a brutal conflict. War is brutal. And Russia, as a sovereign, should be able to conduct that in the way that they see fit. And for the United States to throw their dick around and say, well, we get to say what's right and what's wrong. But if people do that to America, well, that's whataboutism and whatever. So I think that, realism is what keeps the world safe. I think that diplomacy is what keeps the world safe. And respecting sovereignty begins and ends with those tricky issues like torture, like so-called war crimes or whatever. And we're obviously not talking about war crimes like exterminating a population, like gassing people, like using banned chemical weapons, like rules of war. But what they did in Chechnya, it's very easy for Americans to come in and judge, but it's like Russia's got the biggest Muslim population in Europe. They have a lot of terrorists and radicals there. There were a lot of problems there. Like, it's easy to judge, but it's an insurgency. That's how these things are fought. And so anyway, so that's my answer.
Okay, gotcha. Just curious. Final question that's 90 degrees off of all of this in a completely different direction. And you don't have to answer this if this is vital to your business. I'm just so curious. So obviously you do some of these conferences and you're able to get some pretty mainstream Republicans that will invariably disavow you afterwards. It almost feels sometimes like I'm watching Borat, where people get drafted into the Fuentes convention and then afterwards they're like, oh, I don't know who the fuck that is. I didn't do, like, how do you feel about that? Do you view these people as allies and then backstabbers, or do you feel that you kind of got to one over them? You've like tricked them by bringing them onto your thing, and then now you've gotten their implicit endorsement, whether they want it or not. Like, what is your, I guess, how do you view them orbiting around you and your relationship with them? What does that feel like?
That's a tricky question. Well, I know you had a similar situation with your candidate for mayor. And you understand this. It's a difficult situation because politicians have different pressures. And so, and here's the thing, like when I bring people to my conference, they're speaking to my audience. It's the America First Political Action Conference is meant to be a substitute for CPAC. We're trying to take over the conservative movement. And, I'm a very controversial guy. So I don't take it as a backstab when these people go out and say, oh, I don't support what he said. I don't know who he is. It doesn't matter. I'm the master of ceremonies. I'm the sort of circus leader. I bring the acts. I bring the dancing bear. I bring the whatever. Not to be degrading towards these people, but you know what I'm saying. It's like I'm the host, and so in the same way, like Matt Schlapp is a liberal. Matt and Mercedes Schlapp, they run CPAC. These people are liberals. Nobody holds it against the conservatives that go to CPAC that they go to a conference hosted by Matt Schlapp. I'm more controversial, but we're trying to build a big tent, America First Alliance. It creates problems when these people come to my conference politically because of like Kevin McCarthy and others. But I don't take it as a backstab because, we're trying to build a big tent thing. We understand what we're up against. It's difficult to move the needle on these issues. But ultimately, I think what will win out is that the base is closer to us than they are to CPAC. Say whatever you will about us. The worst things you could say about us are not as bad as the worst things you could say about CPAC. And maybe, I know liberals have a hard time with this, but it's like, me being called the white nationalist, like conservatives don't care about that because when we hear that, we just hear like, oh, you're the boogeyman. But when liberals at CPAC support abortion, we view that as like, that's something that's against our moral values. That's like a huge red line for us. And so ultimately that will win out. It's like, okay, do we go to CPAC where they support abortion and they support, all this horrible stuff that we're against, or do we support AFPAC where, liberals are going to complain, but that's not, that's where we are, So that's
because liberals will complain about conservatives no matter what, right?
Right. Do
you, so I'm curious, and this might be a hard one. Do you ever consider that for the success of the America First movement, would you ever consider like stepping away from that to let a less controversial figure kind of like move it forward? Or what if it came, not saying that this is happening, but what if it came to a point to where America First was on the cusp of maybe breaking a little bit more in, but it seemed like you were hitting this, I'll say glass ceiling a few times where past things that you said have kind of like kept that from moving forward? Do you ever take a step back from everything and work behind the scenes like a shady person, or what, or is that just maybe, who knows, you'll just see when it happens?
Maybe, but a big part of what we're doing is like, I sort of have to be a part of it only because, there's this concept of the revolution. Like we're trying to revolutionize the party. And to an extent, if I'm not a part of it, it's almost like we're giving ground to the establishment. And it's like, if they could kick me out and say, oh, we don't want his baggage, it's like the establishment is conquering the revolution, and we want the revolution to conquer the establishment. So I always make, and this is an old Stalin argument, but Stalin used to say, who is conquering who? Is the revolution conquering, or is the revolution being conquered? And I say, insofar as I'm the face of it, we're not canceled, we're not controlled, we're not bought, we're not conceding. So I think it's actually important that someone like me is leading it, because if they're not, it's the same thing that happened to the Tea Party. Let's sweep aside the controversial, even like Trumpism without Trump. They say we want Trumpism without Trump. It's like, well, we need Trump because Trump is the essence of Trumpism. If we have Trumpism led by DeSantis, that's not Trumpism.
You've watered it down to something that becomes indistinguishable of what you've almost like the prior movement has assimilated the revolution and become,
The revolution's been conquered, yes. What about you, Destiny? Do you have any political ambitions, huh?
I really, really, really the next 2 weeks want to get to Diamond 4 in League of Legends. That's what I'm driving for. We'll see what happens.
Do you play Valorant?
Nope, not unfortunately. Don't worry. We'll figure something out. Final question, just randomly, because I don't talk to you often. Do you think that Trump is coming back to run again? Do you think that's going to happen?
Yeah, I don't think he's decided yet, but I think he will. And
do you think there's going to be a huge schism in the Republican Party when it happens, or do you think enough people? Because I feel like I would be worried as a Republican. Like, let's say most people like him, but is that enough? Like, if it ends up being like an 80% of the Republicans, like, do you just lose such a huge base that was against him for whatever they feel about January 6th or coronavirus or whatever? Does that represent more of a threat to the Republican Party, or is it necessary? Is it without Trump, there isn't somebody strong enough to oppose? What are, like, right now in a pretty unpopular administration by the Democrats, to be fair, like, do they win without Trump? Is Trump coming back for sure? Yeah, I'm just curious what you think about it.
I think they have a really strong chance no matter what, because you're right. There's no presumptive front runner. Biden, I don't think will run. Kamala's not popular enough. And then who's left? Buttigieg, Warren, Newsom. They just don't have a lot of good options. But yeah, I think Trump, if he ran, I think it would just be over. On the primary side, I think Trump would easily sail to get the nomination, like he did in 2016. And I think it would be a good thing, because it would create a foil, because it's like, if he has to run against the establishment, he'll have to differentiate. And I think that'll push him further to the right, because he ran as an independent in 2016. He ran as a Republican in 2020, and running in 2024 against DeSantis or Pence would push him toward that like middle thing again, where he's, because if you look back at 2016, he's very different. And, you can understand the appeal. And 2020 becomes like a Sean Hannity, which sucks. So I think.
So you think if he ran against establishment candidates, you think he would move further to the center or further to the right? Seems hard, because it felt like Trump was more of like a character and like a cult of personality, rather than like a consistent set of I'm sure even you would admit this. Trump is not like a man of conservative principles and values, right? But he definitely had like a character to resist the establishment that was relatively unique in him, that wasn't like maybe the beacon of values like somebody might say like Pence or somebody is, or whatever, right? So do you think he moves further to the right or more moderate if he has to run against like a bunch of like Ted Cruz, Mike Pence-esque DeSantis figures or whatever?
Well, it depends on how you view the spectrum, because Pence and Cruz are more so-called like traditional conservatives than Trump is. Mm-hmm. But I view Trump where he is more right wing, because I view Pence and Cruz as like they concede a lot of ground to liberals, and like this free market stuff and limited government. I view that as actually middle, as opposed to Trump, who is more like it's big government. I don't think big government is left wing. Like Trump said, we're going to take care of everybody, with healthcare. Like that's not the free market position on healthcare. So I agree. Trump isn't but that's a good thing. He's not a mainstream, conventional conservative. He's a different flavor, and he is a character. And, he understands as we're in a war here. He's like, I just want to win. And conservatives are like, yeah, we want to be on the winning team. We want to run shit. We want our side to win. So I think that he'll be forced to think more like that, as opposed to, because DC changed him and DC made him into another Republican. And I hate that. Okay. Real. It's true. Take it from me. I would know. I mean, I regret this. The dissolution of the Trump administration was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 21st century.
Okay. All right. I think that's all I got. Okay, cool.
Well, we're best friends now, but you and I'm so glad we're best friends now, and I welcome you as a griper. You should come to when are you going to stream on Cozy? Everyone's wondering, when are you going to get your Cozy channel?
As soon as I get banned on Twitch, I guess we'll see how much further left the kind of corporate meeting and everything goes. Who knows? So I'm in favor of like owning guns or whatever. Maybe that'll be the thing that gets me banned. Who knows?
And you hate trannies, so
I love trans people. I absolutely love trans. I have nothing but love for my.
I support your war against transsexuals.
Absolutely,
I'll give billions, $5 billion in aid to your.
I'm glad you reminded. There's some good trans porn I need to go jerk off to right now, actually. So thank you for reminding me of that.
You ruined
appreciate it. Some chicks with dicks, some good food shit. Oh my God. I need some femboys in my fucking porn feed.
Oh, come on.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for the
poison
reminder.
pilled it. You poison pilled it.
All right.
Gentlemen, thank you. It was a pleasure.
You are a juggernaut of content. I don't know how you do it with seemingly your life falling apart around you. You still manage to do these streams. So
hey,
congratulations.
I never stop, sir. Let's go. Salute to both you gentlemen. Have a good one. Be safe this weekend.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
All right, thanks. Good night.
All right. Now, let's see here. I never stop, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It was amazing.
Amazing.
Thank you,
stream.
faggot. Oh, wow.
Of the old
That was
days.
very nice.
Keep it up and fuck the haters.
Keep it up.
Hashtag kill stream.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. Thank you, Cal Poly. That was very nice of you. Wow, nice things coming in. I thought he was talking
I
shit.
am a multi-billionaire. I created
What?
Hex to save you all. Hex is the future.
What?
Google Hex.
Multi-billionaires support the show. Thank you guys, man. It was a pleasure. It was a beauty all day long. Just 2 weeks to flatten the Serb. There's some ruble donations. Holy shit, that was a pleasure. I'm going to go ahead and get off here, have a little snack, and then head up the road to Rochester. My daughter's on the way, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. I had a really fun day today, about not quite 12 hours, but we went almost, actually we did go 11 hours. So we didn't make 12, but we made 11. Thank you so much. Thank you to Mr. Nicholas J. Fuentes here, the kingpin of Cozy, and also a participant in this debate tonight. Thank you to Destiny, Stephen Bonnell. He will be in Dallas April 2nd, killstream.live/bowl. He'll be debating Harrison Smith live next week, next Thursday. We have Adam Green versus E. Michael Jones. On April 15th, we have Ryan Dawson versus Martinez Perspective. We never stop. We never fucking stop, ladies and gentlemen. Do you understand? We never fucking stop. The Killstream unabortable competition on Suicide Watch. It ain't even really a motherfucking competition. Let's be real. It ain't no fucking competition. We blowing them out of the water, ladies and gentlemen. We killing it. Do you understand? Thank you. All right. Now I'll be normal and stop ranting. I don't want to, though.